Close your eyes for a moment and picture yourself walking through a medieval village. Streets are narrow, muddy, and filled with the sounds of horses' hooves clattering on cobblestone. Smoke rises from thatched roofs. The smell of firewood and damp earth hangs in the air. Everywhere you turn, life feels harsher, darker, and infinitely stranger than the modern world you know today. Now, imagine these people didn't use toilet paper. They feared the very air they breathed, and some believed cats were creatures of the devil. Mirrors were sometimes covered at night because many were convinced they could steal your soul. And in the middle of town, there might even be animals inside the church, bleating sheep or clucking chickens, mingling with prayers and incense. This is not the polished history taught in school. This is the raw, unfiltered truth of how medieval people lived, suffered, and survived. Over the next 3 hours, you are going to journey with me into that world. A world filled with bizarre beliefs, terrifying fears, and strange habits that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the Middle Ages. But before we begin, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments below, where are you watching from right now? Which country? Which city? And what time is it as you step back into the medieval world with us? Are you watching in the middle of the night, surrounded by silence, letting the shadows in your room grow darker as the story unfolds? Or are you tuning in while the sun shines, perhaps with a coffee in hand, trying to imagine how different life was just a few centuries ago? Your answers help us connect as a community across time zones and countries, all brought together by the same curiosity for hidden history. Because, let's be honest, most people would never know this side of the Middle Ages. Most people only hear about kings and queens, knights and castles, great battles and famous wars. But that's just the surface. The truth is far more human, sometimes disgusting, sometimes hilarious, and often shocking. These are the secrets of ordinary life, the taboos, the mysteries, and the forgotten practices that made up everyday survival. And here is the real hook. Many of these strange habits and beliefs still echo into our world today. You might even recognize some traditions or superstitions that have survived in one form or another into the 21st century. For example, why did people fear fresh air, believing it could kill them? Why did they cover mirrors at night or treat cats as if they were agents of evil? Why did entire villages rely on a single gong farmer to deal with their waste in ways that will make your stomach churn? We're going to uncover it all. From the dirty, smelly jobs no one wanted, to the strange cures that people swore by, to the habits that accidentally spread the Black Death across Europe. This journey is not just about strange facts, it's about stepping into their shoes, feeling what they felt, and seeing the world the way they saw it. Now, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered what it truly felt like to live in the Middle Ages? Not as a king, not as a knight, but as an ordinary villager, with fears, beliefs, and rituals that shaped every part of daily life. Have you ever imagined what it was like to sleep in the dark of a wooden hut, hearing wolves howl in the distance, clutching your rosary? Squatting in the corner of the room was quietly holding your soul? Or to walk into a church expecting silence, incense, and holy prayer, only to find animals roaming between the pews, bleating and braying as the priest spoke? This is history like you've never experienced before. Not the battles and the politics, but the strange, forbidden lifestyle of ordinary people. And tonight, we open that door. But before we step inside this hidden world, I want you to prepare yourself. Because once you enter, you won't be looking at history the same way ever again. Think of this video not as a simple documentary, but as a time machine. For the next few hours, you're going to see, hear, and feel the Middle Ages as if you were there. Every sound, every superstition, every candlelit corner of their world will become yours. And remember, while kings, war crowns, and knights rode into battle, most of the people who lived through this era were peasants, workers, mothers, fathers, children, just like us. They had the same hopes, fears, and struggles for survival. The difference is, their world was bound by mystery, religion, superstition, and hardship at a level we can barely imagine. So, as the choir fades and the torches flicker, ask yourself this: what would you have believed if you were born in a medieval village? Would you have feared the plague as God's punishment? Would you have trusted a priest more than a doctor? Would you have crossed yourself at the sight of a black cat, or prayed at night that demons would not visit your dreams? These are not just curiosities. These beliefs shaped lives. They guided choices, and in many cases, they decided who lived and who died. Now, let me give you a small taste of what's to come. We'll walk through medieval streets where butchers tossed animal guts straight into the gutter, where children played next to open sewage, and where the smell of burning tallow candles mixed with the stench of unwashed bodies. We'll step into homes where families lived shoulder to shoulder with animals, lice, and fleas sometimes, sharing a single bed. Ghent will uncover rituals that were supposed to protect against death, but often invited it in. And perhaps most disturbing of all, we reveal the hidden fears that haunted people's minds when the lights went out, when shadows stretched long across the walls, and when the silence of night was broken by distant howls or whispered prayers. This is not the history of swords and crowns. This is the history of mud and blood, sweat and smoke, laughter and fear. This is the true medieval world, and I want you to do something for me right now. Scroll down to the comments and tell me, where are you watching from? Which city? Which country? Most importantly, what time is it where you are stepping into this journey? Are you listening to this while lying in bed, the room dark, letting your imagination transport you into the Middle Ages? Or are you in the middle of the day, maybe at work or school, sneaking away a moment of curiosity about history's forgotten truths? Your answers matter, because this is not just my story to tell, it's our story to share. This community grows every day because of people like you who are curious enough to look beyond the surface of history. And every comment helps us connect across continents, across cultures, across time itself. Together, we're building something extraordinary, a circle of history lovers who are not afraid to ask the strange questions, not to explore the uncomfortable details, and to uncover the truths that textbooks often leave out. So, are you ready? Because once this journey begins, there's no turning back. The torches are lit, the gates of the medieval village creak open, and the wind whispers through the ruins of time, inviting us in. Step carefully. Every superstition, every ritual, every shadow in this world meant something. And tonight, for the next 3 hours, they will mean something to you too. Welcome to the hidden life of the Middle Ages.
What if I told you that in the Middle Ages, holy spaces were not always as holy as you imagine? Picture this. You walk into a medieval church expecting silence, incense, and prayer end. Instead, you're greeted by the bleating of goats, the scratching of chickens, and the low grunt of a pig rooting in the dirt floor. This isn't fiction. For centuries, animals were kept inside churches, mingling with worshippers, and the reasons behind this strange practice will make you question everything you think you know about medieval life. Before we uncover this forbidden truth, hit subscribe right now, because these are the kinds of stories you were never meant to hear, the ones scrubbed out of the official chronicles. And if you've ever wondered how the sacred and the profane could mix so closely, drop a comment with what animal you'd least like to sit next to in church, and let's see what the community thinks. Imagine it is the year 1310. You step into a stone church in a small English village. The door creaks shut behind you, but instead of being surrounded only by flickering candles and monks chanting psalms, you hear the clucking of hens. They are not just wandering by accidents. Some of them roost in the rafters. Near the altar, a stray dog curls up to nap. In the corner, a villager ties a goat to a post leaving it there during Mass. The smell of hay and manure mixes with incense. Why? Because for medieval people, churches were not just houses of God, they were communal spaces central to life, and sometimes even treated like barns. But this is not just about practicality. There was superstition, ritual, and even conspiracy behind it. Some churches allowed animals in because they were believed to carry symbolic meaning. Roosters were connected to resurrection, cats to protection from demons, and donkeys to humility. Yet these symbolic reasons blurred into strange practices. In some towns, animals were led into the church for blessings. In others, they were punished like people. Medieval records show pigs put on trial for crimes and sometimes locked in churchyards, as if God himself was their judge. One famous case in Falaise, France, in 1386, tells of a pig tried for killing a child, convicted, and then dressed in human clothing before being executed outside the church. And while this was punishment, it shows the strange intersection between animal life and holy ritual. Archaeology adds more evidence. Excavations of old church floors in rural Europe have revealed layers of straw mixed with dung, suggesting that animals were indeed kept inside, not just once, but repeatedly, even regularly. This wasn't just a one-off accident. It was part of village life. In places where barns were unsafe or non-existent, the warm stone walls of the church offered protection for livestock at night. Imagine cows lowing beneath the same roof as sermons were spoken. The sacred mixed with survival. But the truth goes deeper, because the church hierarchy hated this practice. Bishops issued repeated decrees forbidding animals in churches. One 12th century synod declared that beasts shall not tread where the Lord is worshipped, and yet the people ignored them. Why? Because villagers believed that keeping animals near sacred relics or altars offered protection. Chickens near the altar meant better egg laying. Sheep brought into churchyards before shearing were said to give softer wool. Pigs tethered near relics were believed to grow stronger and fatter. The sacred wasn't just for prayer, it was for survival. This strange mixing of holy and practical life became so widespread that even priests sometimes looked the other way. In one case, recorded in a German manuscript from the 14th century, a priest complained that villagers refused to attend Mass unless allowed to bring their chickens with them because they feared theft. Another letter, written by an abbot in Italy, describes the uproar of beasts during sermons, yet admits he tolerated it because otherwise the villagers would stop coming altogether. Imagine preaching about sin and salvation while a goat bleated in the background. And yet, beneath this oddity lies a darker truth. Some historians argue that the church deliberately erased or minimized these stories because they blurred the line between sacred and profane, between holy ritual and peasant survival. To admit that animals were kept in churches would tarnish the image of medieval piety. That is why many chronicles skip over these details, mentioning them only in passing, as if embarrassed. But the evidence survives in fragments in archaeology, in parish records, in scattered complaints from bishops. The symbolism went even further. In some villages, animals were part of festival rituals inside churches. During the Feast of Fools, donkeys were led into churches, even up to the altar, to symbolize the donkey that carried Mary and the Christ child. Parishioners would bray like donkeys in mockery, blending sacred play with shocking irreverence. Church councils condemned this blasphemy, but it persisted for centuries. Why would such practices survive unless they had deeper meaning? Some suggest it was a hidden protest by peasants against the power of the church, a way to mock authority under the guise of tradition. But let's not forget the darker, practical side disease. By keeping animals inside churches, medieval people unknowingly increased the spread of parasites and infections. Fleas from pigs and dogs carried plague. Lice from sheep and goats thrived in the communal warmth of villagers and livestock crammed together. Some physicians of the time even warned against bringing beasts into holy places, claiming the air became corrupted. Yet their voices were ignored, silenced, or dismissed. When the Black Death swept through Europe, could the mingling of animals and humans in sacred spaces have worsened its spread? It's a chilling thought, but one historians rarely discuss. And then there is conspiracy. Some whispers suggest that certain banned or heretical groups, like the Cathars, were accused of profaning churches by deliberately bringing animals inside, not as survival, but as ritual mockery. The Inquisition's records mention accusations of turning churches into stables, though whether this was true or simply propaganda is unknown. Could it be that some stories of animals in churches were exaggerated to smear heretical groups, making them seem unholy? Or could it be that the church erased most examples except when it could weaponize them? Either way, the truth lies buried between fact and silence. Fast forward to today, and the idea seems absurd, impossible even. Yet medieval villagers lived in a world where the sacred and mundane were not separate. A church was not just a holy space. It was the heart of the community. It was a gathering hall, a meeting place, a shelter, and sometimes even a barn. The animals inside were not intrusions. They were part of life itself. So why was this story buried? Why are we only now piecing it together from fragments? Because official history prefers the polished version. Gleaming cathedrals, solemn priests, devout peasants. Not chickens roosting above the altar. Not goats bleating during Mass. Not the raw truth that survival sometimes mattered more than sanctity. And that is why this story matters. It is not just trivia about animals in churches. It reveals how medieval life blurred boundaries, how survival dictated behavior, how official authority was often ignored, and how truth was later censored. It shows us that history is messy, alive, and far stranger than we were ever told. So, the next time you walk into a quiet, polished church, imagine the scene centuries ago. Imagine the candlelight flickering across straw-strewn floors. Imagine the smell of incense mixed with manure. Imagine a goat tugging at its rope while a priest preached. That was the medieval world, raw, strange, and unforgettable. And it is a world whose secrets still whisper to us if we are willing to listen. Before you go, remember this: history is never what it seems. The strangest truths are often the ones erased. So hit subscribe, drop a comment with what animal you would never want to sit next to in church, and share this video to make sure these buried stories are never silenced again.
Imagine this: a silent medieval village under the glow of the moon. The wind stirs the thatched roofs, and the only sound is the distant, eerie screech of a cat. To us, it's nothing more than a sound of the night. But in the Middle Ages, that cry wasn't just unsettling, it was terrifying. 2 million of people, cats were not innocent companions. They were demons in disguise, servants of witches, creatures of Satan himself. And what followed from this belief would change the course of history in ways no one at the time could have imagined. Before we go deeper into this forbidden story, I want to ask you something. Would you have dared to keep a cat in medieval Europe, knowing it could mark you as a witch or even a servant of the devil? Think about it, and if you're hooked already, make sure to subscribe, like, and drop a comment below, because what you're about to hear is the kind of history that was buried, rewritten, and nearly forgotten. In the Middle Ages, fear was everywhere. Fear of disease, fear of famine, fear of the devil lurking in every shadow. Cats, with their mysterious eyes that seemed to glow in the dark, and their independence that defied human control, became perfect symbols of the unknown. Dogs, loyal and obedient, were seen as godly companions. Cats, sly and untamed, were branded as dangerous. People said they slipped into homes at night to steal the breath of infants. They whispered that a black cat crossing your path was not coincidence, was an omen. But this wasn't just village gossip. The Catholic Church itself fueled this fear. In 1233, Pope Gregory IX issued a decree condemning cats, especially black ones, as agents of Satan. This wasn't just a passing opinion. It was an order from the most powerful institution in Europe. Priests across the continent began preaching that cats were evil. Villagers were told that if they owned one, they risked being accused of witchcraft, and so began a brutal campaign against cats. Entire populations of cats were slaughtered. In towns and villages, cats were hunted, burned, and hanged. Festivals were held where live cats were thrown into fires, or locked in barrels and rolled through the streets. It was a purge not just of animals, but of anything that symbolized independence and resistance. Women who dared to keep cats risked their lives. Many were accused of being witches, tortured and executed alongside their feline companions. The message was clear. Cats were not pets. They were the devil's soldiers. The demonization of cats was tied closely to the growing obsession with witchcraft. Witches, people believed, had familiars, spirits that took the form of animals. Cats were said to be the most common. If someone was accused of being a witch, and they happened to own a cat, that alone could seal their fate. Imagine living in a world where feeding a stray cat, or simply being seen near one, could condemn you to the stake. That was the reality of medieval superstition. But here's where history takes a shocking turn. By demonizing and killing cats, medieval Europe created a disaster it could not control. 'Cause without cats, another creature began to thrive. Rats. Rats multiplied in villages, towns, and cities, spreading unchecked through food stores, homes, and streets. And with the rats came fleas. And with the fleas came one of the deadliest pandemics the world has ever seen, the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, the plague swept through Europe, killing as many as 25 million people. Nearly a third of the continent's population. Entire villages disappeared. Families were wiped out in a matter of days. Corpses piled in the streets faster than they could be buried. And though medieval people had no understanding of bacteria, fleas, or disease vectors, they had unknowingly unleashed this devastation upon themselves. By killing cats, they had destroyed the very line of defense that might have slowed the spread of rats, and in turn, the plague itself. The irony is almost too dark to believe. The very animals they thought were satanic may have been their salvation. Instead, superstition, fear, and blind obedience to authority condemned millions. And yet, even in the face of such devastation, the belief in the evil of cats persisted. Many thought the plague was punishment from God, that witches and their cats had brought it upon the world. Rather than protecting the creatures that might have helped, they destroyed more of them. Not all societies, however, viewed cats with suspicion. Some monasteries quietly kept cats to protect manuscripts and food stores. Sailors and merchants often brought cats on ships to protect grain from rodents. In Viking culture, cats were considered sacred, tied to the goddess Freya, who was said to ride in a chariot pulled by two giant felines. To the Norse, cats were symbols of fertility and fortune, not evil. But in Christian Europe, especially after papal decrees, fear and hatred dominated. As the Middle Ages wore on, cats became more deeply tied to witchcraft. Witches were believed to transform into cats, or to send their feline companions to carry out curses. Tales spread of cats walking through walls, vanishing into thin air, or speaking in human tongues. In folklore, the devil himself sometimes appeared as a black cat. By the time of the witch hunts in the late medieval and early modern periods, owning a cat was almost a death sentence. It was undeniable proof of guilt. Even as the plague returned in waves, the suspicion of cats never fully lifted. In many towns, the idea that killing cats only made things worse never occurred. Fear blinded people to the truth. And even centuries later, when Enlightenment thinkers began to challenge superstition, the image of the black cat as an omen of bad luck endured. To this day, Halloween decorations show cats with arched backs and glowing eyes, echoes of the medieval nightmare. In some parts of the world, black cats are still seen as unlucky, a lingering scar from centuries of fear. So, what does this story really tell us? That fear can be more deadly than any disease. The belief that cats were demonic did not just shape medieval culture, it may have changed the course of European history. By destroying their cat populations, Europeans may have made the plague worse, amplifying the very suffering they sought to avoid. It is one of the clearest examples of superstition backfiring in devastating ways. Think about the consequences. The church sought to rid the world of evil by condemning cats, but in doing so, it unleashed one of history's greatest horrors. Ordinary people believed they were defending themselves from demons, but in truth, they were destroying their only defense against the real threat. And all of it began with fear, the fear of what they didn't understand. Even now, black cats carry that legacy. They are symbols of bad luck, of mystery, of the supernatural. But when we see them, we are looking at centuries of fear, centuries of superstition, centuries of lives lost to a belief that was never true. So the next time a black cat crosses your path, remember this. In the Middle Ages, that moment could have condemned you as a witch. And by fearing cats, medieval Europe may have sealed its own fate during the plague. History, once again, proves that what people fear most is often the very thing they need the most. But here, that's the question I'll leave you with. Were cats truly feared because they were mysterious? Or was the church using fear to control the people, shaping a narrative that served its own power? And if history could be rewritten once, could it happen again? If this story shocked you, make sure to subscribe, cause we're only just scratching the surface of the strange, forgotten, and forbidden truths of the Middle Ages. History may not be what you were told. What if the worst job in medieval Europe was not fighting in wars, not breaking rocks in quarries, but crawling waist-deep into pits of human waste under cover of darkness? Before we uncover this disgusting and dangerous truth, hit subscribe right now. Because the history you're about to hear is the kind they buried, sometimes literally in filth. Drop a comment with what you think was the worst medieval job, and like this video so that stories they erased don't stay buried forever. Now, imagine this. The year is 1370. The city is London. By day, the streets are clogged with people merchants shouting, children darting between carts, pigs snuffling in refuse. Chamber pots are emptied from windows into narrow alleys. Gutters run with liquid waste. The stench hangs heavy in the air. But at night, when the city sleeps, a shadowy figure enters. He carries a wooden shovel, a leather bucket, and a lantern. He heads, not to a tavern, not to a church, but to the cesspit. This man is the gong farmer, the most despised worker of the Middle Ages. His task? To climb down into pits of human excrement, dig it out, and carry it away. The very word gong comes from an old term meaning filth. To call the gong farmer was to summon someone willing to crawl into the lowest corners of medieval life. These men were paid to remove human waste from latrines, privies, and cesspits, usually by night, so that no one had to see or smell them at work. It was a job so foul, so feared, and yet so essential that entire cities depended on them. And hidden in their story lies a shocking truth about class, control, and the secrets of medieval society. The first clue comes from city records in 14th century England. These documents mention payments made to men called gong, scourers, or nightmen. They were instructed to work only after dark and never to dump their loads within city walls. Instead, they carted their barrels of filth outside, spreading it on fields as fertilizer, or, more secretly, selling it to farmers. Imagine the irony. Waste transformed into wealth, and the dirtiest job fueling the bread on medieval tables. But archaeology reveals even more disturbing details. In excavations of old cesspits beneath London and York, layers of human waste preserved fragments of rags, queues, bones, and even seeds from medieval meals. In some pits, leather gloves and scraps of cloth hint that gong farmers tried to protect themselves, though records also describe many dying young from disease, suffocation, or collapse of rotten wooden floors. One chilling account describes a gong farmer who fell into a cesspit and drowned. His body was recovered hours later, the stench so powerful that workers refused to continue for days. Yet, strangely, despite the horror, this job paid well. Records from Tudor England show gong farmers earning more in a week than a skilled craftsman. They were forbidden from living within city walls, shunned socially, but they were necessary when necessity gave them bargaining power. They were paid in coin, in food, even in ale, and sometimes protected by city law. Here lies the paradox. The dirtiest job was also one of the most lucrative. But why would city officials, guilds, and even the church allow this, unless there was more to the story? Here's where the mystery deepens. Some accounts suggest that cesspits contained more than waste. Hidden in the muck were discarded objects, broken jewelry, fragments of parchment, even coins. A gong farmer could easily pocket these finds, giving him access to items that others might never see again. Was this tolerated or quietly encouraged? In fact, one record describes a gong farmer caught with precious relics, smudged and befouled, taken from the pit of the friars. He was imprisoned briefly, but then vanished from records, suppression, or silence. The church, too, seemed uneasy with the profession. Priests warned against the handlers of filth carrying curses into homes, yet city councils depended on them, even hiring gong farmers to clean monastic latrines. Think about that contradiction. Monasteries, preaching purity, relying on men condemned for unclean work. One forgotten manuscript in the Vatican secret archives even mentions that cesspits near monasteries were sometimes used to dispose of unwanted manuscripts, heretical texts, banned works, or letters too dangerous to preserve. Could it be that gong farmers stumbled upon forbidden knowledge, buried in waste? If so, that might explain why their lives and records remained shadowy, why their profession was both indispensable and despised. The hidden truth may be this: gong farmers were not just waste collectors, they were gatekeepers of secrets. Imagine tearing out pages from a heretical prophecy, casting it into the pit, and years later, a gong farmer's hands dragging it back into the light. They knew too much. They saw what others discarded physically and metaphorically. To silence them, society reduced them to filth, to shadows, so that no one would believe their stories. Mainstream historians dismiss these ideas as exaggerations. They argue that gong farmers were simple laborers, not conspirators or secret keepers. But ask yourself, why are there so few surviving records of them, despite their importance? Why do entire city statutes describe their duties in vague terms, while accounts of bakers, butchers, and even beggars are detailed? Why did priests urge people never to speak of the works of nightmen in public? And why do redacted council records show payments to gong farmers for special duties? Duties never explained. If it is all true, then we must face a disturbing revelation. The dirtiest job in history may also have been one of the most dangerous, not just to health, but to knowledge. Gong farmers were literal diggers of secrets, handling not only waste, but fragments of daily life, discarded documents, and perhaps suppressed truths. Their silence may have been bought with coin or enforced with fear. So, what if history's filthiest job was also its most important? What if beneath the mug lay not just bones and rags, but stories erased by kings, priests, and councils? And what if those stories about disease, heresy, or forbidden knowledge could have changed the course of history, if only they had been allowed to surface? Think of this. The Black Death spread through filth and poor sanitation, yet chronicles blamed God's wrath. To admit that cesspits and waste spread plague would mean admitting responsibility. It's easier to bury the truth in those who worked closest to it. Gong farmers became both saviors and scapegoats, cleaning the very filth that rulers refused to acknowledge. And so, when you hear the phrase, the worst job in history, think again. Was it really the worst, or was it the most silenced? Was the gong farmer simply a digger of muck, or an unwilling keeper of medieval secrets? History may not be what you were told. It never is. And I'll leave you with this. If knowledge could be buried once in pits of filth, could it happen again today? Hidden, not in waste, but in distraction and silence. Subscribe now, because truth, no matter how foul, always finds its voice. You sit at a long wooden table, casting shadows on faces you barely know. Okay, before we uncover what's really on that table, if you love the dark, hidden truths of medieval Europe, make sure you subscribe right now. These untold files drop every week. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? The smell of roasted meat fills the hall, mixed with smoke, sweat, and the sour tank of ale. A servant sets down a steaming platter boar, dripping with fat, its skin crackling. Others follow, trenchers of bread, bowls of porridge, salted fish, and pies, or stomach growls. Okay? But here's the secret. No one tells you. The very food in front of you could kill you. We picture medieval life as knights feasting endlessly. But what people really ate was a gamble. Every bite could nourish or destroy. Okay? If you were unlucky, the meal before you could be your last. Imagine you're a peasant in the 13th century. Your daily food. Bread, not fluffy loaves, but hard, dark bread, baked from rye and barley. It fills your stomach, but there's a hidden danger in every slice. A black fungus called ergot. Eat it, and your hands twist in pain. Your skin burns like fire. Your mind filled with visions of demons. Its entire villages convulsed and screamed, believing hell itself had broken loose. The church called it divine punishment, but in truth, it was just bread that could kill. Now, imagine you're a noble. Your table groans under meat, pork, venison, beef, swan. But here's the secret. No one dared whisper. Without refrigeration, most of it was spoiled. Servants masked the stench with heavy spices. You would lift a golden goblet, tear into a roast, never knowing if what you ate carried invisible killers. And that wasn't the only danger. The poison was real. Arsenic in wine, powdered metals in pies. A rival could smile across the table while slipping death into your meal. More kings and dukes than you'd think fell not on the battlefield, but at their own banquets. Pause. Think about that. Would you take another bite or push your plate away? The peasants didn't even have that choice. Their survival came from pottage, a stew of beans, cabbage, onions, peas, thick, filling, and deadly, because the water was filthy. Rivers carried waste, disease, and parasites, so every spoonful could infect you. Okay? That's why even children drank ale boiled in brewing, safer than water itself. Before I reveal the deadliest medieval food, make sure you're subscribed. Keys, declassified files of medieval life, drop every week, and trust me, you don't want to miss the next one. Now, let's talk about fish. The church forbade meat for nearly half the year. That meant fish, fish, and more fish. But in towns far from the sea, fish had to be preserved, salted, dried, or pickled. By the time it reached your plate, it could be crawling with worms. Still, you ate it. Because hunger doesn't wait for freshness. And then there was honey. Sweet, golden, safe. Or so it seemed. In regions where bees fed on toxic plants, their honey became poisonous. A pie filled with mad honey could make you vomit, hallucinate, even die. Imagine being served dessert, then slipping into visions of fire and demons. Would you call it witchcraft or just bad luck? Okay? Grand banquets, danger wasn't just on the plate. Tid was in politics. Okay? Refuse a dish, and you might insult a lord. Drink from the wrong cup, and you might be accused of cowardice. Every bite was not only survival, but a test of loyalty. A medieval table was more dangerous than the battlefield, and famine only made it worse. In years when crops failed, peasants mixed bark, weeds, even acorns into bread. It filled bellies, but some of these famine foods were toxic. They left people weak, paralyzed, or dead. Yet, they ate them anyway. Conga has no patience. The rich weren't safe either. Their addiction to sugar and meat brought gout, obesity, and sudden death. Their obsession with exotic spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, clothes cost fortunes, but counterfeit spices filled the markets. Some were mixed with powdered brick, others with deadly dust. Every taste of cinnamon was a gamble with fate. Here's a cliffhanger for you. Medieval doctors knew more than we think. Hidden in their manuscripts are warnings: spoiled fish corrupts the stomach. Dark grains bring madness. Too much meat inflames the blood. They didn't understand germs, but they weren't blind. Okay? They saw the patterns, and still, most ignored them, because food in medieval Europe wasn't just survival. It was power. The nobility's endless feasts reminded peasants of their place. The church's fasting days controlled diets. Every meal was tied to faith, status, and control. To eat was to play politics. Now, picture yourself again at that banquet. The hall is filled with music, dice, laughter. Then, silence. A noble across from you gasps, his hand clutching his throat. He collapses onto the table. Poison, spoiled meat, God's wrath. No one dares to speak. Your eyes drop to your plate, your cup, and suddenly the food before you doesn't look so safe anymore. Before I tell you the final twist, if you've been holding your breath like I have, make sure you're subscribed. These declassified medieval files drop every week, because here's the darkest truth. Even in famine, even in plague, people still believed their food wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. Bread wasn't just bread. Wine wasn't just wine. They were symbols, prayers, curses, salvation, or damnation. To eat was to risk not only your body, but your soul. And that's why what medieval people really ate could kill you not just with poison or disease, but with fear, faith, and power. So, what do you think? Would you risk a bite of rye bread knowing it could drive you mad? Would you sip a goblet of wine, unsure if it carried arsenic? Or would you push your plate away and starve? If you thought this meal was dangerous, wait until you hear about the medieval cures that were far deadlier than the diseases themselves. Subscribe so you don't miss the next file. They say the mirror never lies. But what if, in the Middle Ages, people believed the mirror was not just a tool of truth, but a dangerous trap? A trap for your soul, a doorway for demons, and a curse waiting to strike. Imagine standing in a candlelit chamber in the 14th century. The air smells of smoke and damp wood. A polished bronze mirror hangs on the wall, reflecting your face. The fire, and the shadows flickering across the room. But before the household sleeps, someone approaches with a cloth, draping the mirror carefully, almost reverently. Why? Because in the medieval imagination, to leave a mirror uncovered at night was to invite terror into your home. This wasn't some quaint superstition. To people in the Middle Ages, mirrors were mysterious, dangerous, and often feared. And tonight, we're about to uncover why. Before we dive deeper, let me ask you, would you dare to stand in a darkened room and stare into a mirror at midnight? Would you trust that only your reflection stares back? You felt a shiver just imagining it? Then subscribe now, because the history we explore here is darker than what they ever taught you in school. Now, let's step back in time. For much of the Middle Ages, mirrors weren't made of glass as we know them today. Instead, they were crafted from polished bronze, silver, or obsidian, volcanic glass. These weren't household items for everyone. They were rare, precious, and often associated with wealth, power, or sorcery. To own one was to possess something that blurred the line between the ordinary and the supernatural. That rarity only amplified their mystery. For most medieval people, their only experience of reflection was in water, a pond, a river, or a bucket. But water reflections were unstable, shifting, easily broken. A polished mirror, however, showed something different, something unnaturally precise, your face staring back with impossible clarity. For many, it was unsettling. It was as though another version of you lived inside that strange piece of metal or glass. Okay, and that's where fear crept in. Okay, in folklore, the reflection wasn't just an image. It was thought to contain part of your soul. To gaze too long at your reflection was to weaken yourself, to risk leaving some essence of you trapped in the mirror. Some even believed the mirror itself could steal life, draining vitality the longer you stared. Physicians of the medieval world, influenced by ancient Greek and Roman theories of the humors, sometimes warned that mirrors could upset mental balance. Looking too deeply into one could, they claimed, disturb the humors and invite melancholy, madness, or even possession. This belief led to real behaviors. People didn't casually stare into mirrors, and when the sun set, fear multiplied. Okay. Nighttime was already seen as the hour of demons, ghosts, and wandering spirits. To leave a mirror uncovered was to leave a doorway open. And so, across Europe, people covered their mirrors at dusk. Not for cleanliness, not for beauty, but for survival. This practice became especially urgent in times of death. Medieval tradition held that if someone died in a room with an uncovered mirror, their soul could become trapped inside. Families, desperate to ensure their loved one found peace, would rush to shroud every reflective surface. Imagine the scene: a candlelit room, a body lying still beneath the shroud, and every mirror hidden away in cloth. They weren't just mourning, they were protecting the soul of the dead and the living. But where did these fears originate? Some traced them to Christianity itself. Medieval priests warned that mirrors could be tools of vanity, but also of the devil. They were thought to reflect not just the physical world, but also the invisible. Demons could use them to slip into your home. Witches could use them to summon dark forces. Theologians wrote warnings, and ordinary people whispered rumors. Never let a mirror face a sleeping person. Never stare too long. Never leave it uncovered when night falls. And there were stories, terrifying ones. One 12th century monk wrote that a nobleman in France swore he saw a figure moving behind him in his mirror, but when he turned, the room was empty. Another tale from Germany claimed a mirror once showed the face of a plague victim in a house untouched by sickness. And days later, the disease struck. In rural villages, peasants smashed mirrors after nights of nightmares, convinced they had glimpsed the faces of the dead in their reflections. And these weren't isolated fears. Across cultures, similar warnings appeared. Ancient Roman writings spoke of mirrors capturing souls. Jewish folklore cautioned against uncovered mirrors in homes where someone had died, a tradition that, in some communities, survives to this day. Medieval Europe took these ideas and deepened them with its own obsessions with sin, demons, and death. The fear of mirrors was also tied to witchcraft. In the occult practice of scrying, mirrors, or polished crystals, were used to see visions of the future or to summon spirits. To the church, this was heresy. To ordinary people, it was terrifying proof that mirrors weren't just passive objects. They were tools, portals, weapons. A witch with a mirror was someone who could reach beyond the visible world. And yet, fear coexisted with fascination. Just as people feared mirrors, they couldn't resist their strange power. Nobles commissioned elaborate mirrors, decorated with religious imagery to protect against evil. Alchemists experimented with reflective surfaces, hoping to use them to glimpse hidden truths of the universe. Scholars argued over whether reflections were natural phenomena or spiritual ones. But the ordinary villager, living in a thatched roof home, didn't think about philosophy. They thought about survival. And so the mirror remained something to be hidden at night, covered after death, and feared in silence. Think about the medieval mindset, a world where the Black Death killed millions, where disease and famine struck without warning, where death was an everyday presence. In such a world, anything mysterious carried a weight of dread. And what could be more mysterious than the mirror? An object that seemed to hold a second self, an object that stared back when you stared into it. Even today, echoes of this fear remain in parts of Europe and beyond. Some people still cover mirrors after a death. Superstitions persist about mirrors falling, breaking, or being left uncovered at night. And across the world, horror stories about mirrors continue to haunt us. Perhaps that's why horror films so often feature the mirror scene, where the reflection lingers just a moment too long, or shows something that isn't really there. The medieval fear of mirrors may sound strange, but maybe it isn't so irrational after all. After all, a mirror doesn't just show us as we are. It shows us doubled, inverted, uncanny. It shows us truths we don't always want to face, okay? And if you were a peasant, a monk, or a noble centuries ago, would you really risk leaving that door open at night? So let me ask you again, tonight, when your room is dark and quiet, when the only light is the faint glow of the moon outside your window, will you glance into your mirror? Or will you cover it, as our ancestors once did, just in case? Because history teaches us something unsettling. They didn't laugh at these fears. They lived by them. They believed mirrors could kill, curse, or capture. And maybe, just maybe, they were right. The truth may never be fully uncovered. But perhaps the next time you pass by your reflection, you'll remember the medieval warning. Beware the mirror after dark. It shows not only your face, but what waits beyond, okay? And if history was rewritten once, it can't be rewritten again. Subscribe, because here we uncover the truths they never wanted you to know. What if I told you that in the Middle Ages, people truly believed that the very air around them could kill? Not just foul-smelling air from garbage or sewage, but even a fresh breeze through your window at night. For centuries, ordinary men and women lived in fear of the invisible world around them. Before we uncover why, hit that subscribe button now and join this community where we dig into the hidden truths history doesn't want you to know. And comment below, would you have dared to breathe the night air if you lived back then? Picture this. It is the year 1349. The Black Death has swept across Europe, leaving towns silent, villages half abandoned, and the air heavy with dread. In London, bells tolled every hour as carts piled with bodies rattled through the streets. Families locked their doors and shuttered their windows, not just to keep out thieves or plague doctors, but to keep out the air itself. To breathe was to invite death. To open a window was to gamble with your soul. Why? Because medieval people lived under the powerful influence of an idea known as miasma theory. According to this belief, disease spread through bad air, a kind of invisible vapor rising from rot, filth, or even the cool night breeze. People thought this poison air could seep into your skin, creep into your lungs, and rot you from within. Doctors, priests, and rulers all reinforced this idea. If someone fell ill, it wasn't blamed on rats, poor sanitation, or contaminated water. It was blamed on the air. Fresh air wasn't a cure, it was a killer. To protect themselves, people filled their homes with strong scents. Hay, burned herbs, carried flowers, and wore Pomander's little metal balls, stuffed with spices and vinegar to filter the bad air. The wealthy paid fortunes for exotic spices, like cloves and cinnamon, believing these could keep death away. Nobles would walk down the street with bouquets pressed to their noses. Even the famous plague doctor masks, with their long, bird-like beaks, were stuffed with fragrant herbs, not because they understood germs, but because they thought sweet smells could neutralize poison in the air. But for peasants, survival was far more desperate. Many stuffed rags into the cracks of their huts to keep air out entirely. Families would seal themselves inside, sharing smoky, windowless rooms with animals, convinced that stepping outside at the wrong moment could be fatal. And tragically, their fear only made things worse. With no ventilation, diseases spread faster indoors. Entire households were wiped out not by fresh air, but by the lack of it. This fear of air wasn't just ignorance, it was also a tool of control. The church and ruling elites had every reason to reinforce it. If disease came from God's punishment, carried on the wind, then people couldn't blame kings, priests, or city councils for poor sanitation. You died, it was in tea, because your city was drowning in filth. It was because you hadn't prayed hard enough, or because God had chosen to test you. And so, the rich benefited. Nobles could afford perfumed chambers, rare spices, and masks to protect themselves. They could retreat to countryside estates where the air was fresher, and fewer people meant fewer infections. The poor, meanwhile, were trapped in sealed homes, clinging to rags dipped in wine, vinegar, or even urine, whatever they believed might ward off the deadly air. Archaeology tells us just how deeply this belief shaped medieval life. In plague pits across Europe, researchers have found bundles of herbs, flowers, and burned resins buried with the dead. Families wanted to shield their loved ones from bad air, even in the grave. City records show laws banning foul odors in public. In some towns, cutting onions or garlic in the streets was forbidden, because their smell was thought to awaken the plague. And here's a disturbing truth. People avoided fresh air, but the real killers were hiding elsewhere. Rats carried fleas, fleas carried plague, and filth bred disease. Yet, because the focus was on miasma, sanitation was ignored. Sewage continued to flow in rivers, animal waste piled in the streets, and people died while believing that the breeze was to blame. Looking back, the irony is heartbreaking. Today, we know that ventilation and fresh air actually reduce the spread of disease. Open spaces and sunlight can kill bacteria and viruses. But in the Middle Ages, the very thing that could have saved countless lives was the thing they most feared. Take monasteries, for example. Monks lived, ate, and prayed together in sealed halls filled with incense smoke and stagnant air. When plague struck, entire communities were wiped out in days. Contrast that with peasants in the countryside who worked outside every day, breathing the open air. Many of them survived longer than those locked in the safety of stone walls. But their survival was dismissed as coincidence. Not everyone agreed with miasma theory. In the Islamic world, scholars had long written about the importance of fresh air and clean water. Some early Renaissance physicians in Italy began to suggest that circulation and hygiene mattered. They argued for open courtyards, gardens, and baths. But these ideas threatened the established order. The air was in tea, The problem of sanitation was then the wealthy and powerful could be blamed for the filth of cities. So those voices were often suppressed, their manuscripts hidden or ignored. The fear of air even influenced the design of medieval homes. Windows were tiny, often sealed shut. Thick curtains and shutters blocked out breezes. Chimneys were built in ways that minimized airflow. Side castles and noble estates, rooms were perfumed with lavender, sage, and frankincense, not just for comfort, but to push back the bad air. Imagine living in such a world. To go to bed each night, fearing not just thieves or famine, but the simple act of breathing. To believe that the very wind carried death. This was the reality for millions. Even when the plague wasn't raging, suspicion of air lingered. People believed that night air in particular was dangerous. Walking outside after dark was thought to invite illness. Parents warned children to stay indoors at dusk. Travelers carried charms against the breeze. For centuries, Europeans avoided open air at night, creating a culture of fear that lasted well into the 19th century. In fact, as late as the Victorian era, tuberculosis was sometimes blamed on night air. It shows just how long these medieval beliefs haunted the modern world. So, why does this matter? Because it reveals a timeless truth. Fear shapes behavior more than facts. In the Middle Ages, fear of air kept people obedient, isolated, and dependent on authority. It made them spend money on charms, perfumes, and rituals that offered no real protection. It blinded them to the true causes of disease and gave the powerful yet another way to rule through superstition. And here is the haunting question. If entire civilizations could be convinced that fresh air was deadly, what false beliefs shape our world today? What do we accept as truth now truths? We may laugh at centuries from now, just as we laugh at the fear of wind and night air. So the next time you step outside and take a deep breath, remember that for medieval people, that very act was unthinkable, even terrifying. They lived in a world where the wind itself was a killer, where windows were sealed shut, and where survival meant hiding from the sky. But history teaches us something powerful. The most dangerous poison is often not in the arid S in the stories we are told. Subscribe now, because the truths we uncover about the past are far stranger and far more important than you've ever imagined. What if I told you that in the Middle Ages, people believed bathing could kill you, and that entire generations abandoned water altogether because they were convinced it carried sin, disease, and even heresy? Before we unlock this hidden truth, hit subscribe right now, because the story you're about to hear is the kind of history they buried in monasteries, erased from royal decrees, and suppressed in secret archives. Like this video to make sure these forbidden stories aren't lost again. Comment below with how long you think you could survive without a single bath. Now, let's step back into a world where water was feared as much as it was needed. Imagine it is Paris, the year 1320. The streets are choked with smoke and the stench of waste. But in the heart of the city, a glow rises from wooden bathhouses lit by flickering candles. Men and women sink into steaming tubs, whispering secrets behind curtains of vapor. For the wealthy, it is a place of indulgence perfumes, oils, massages, even musicians playing while nobles soak in luxury. For peasants, it is a rare relief from endless filth. And yet, within a century, these same bathhouses would be shuttered, condemned as dens of lust and death. The mystery is this: why did an entire civilization turn against bathing? Why did water itself become something to fear? Our first clue lies in a 12th century medical text from the school of Salerno, the Regimen Sanitatis Salernitenum. In its earliest form, bathing was praised as essential to health. Warm water cleansed the pores, revived the spirit, and even strengthened the heart. Physicians across Europe advised nobles to bathe regularly to prevent illness. And yet, later versions of this same text contain ominous additions. Marginal notes written in Latin warning that excessive bathing inflames lust, weakens the body, and invites disease. Who added these warnings? Some point to church scribes who copied medical texts, but quietly changed their message, turning the medicine of water into the morality of abstinence. Then came the Black Death. In 1347, plague ships docked in Sicily. Taba, by 1348, half of Europe was dying. Theories spread like wildfire. Was it God's punishment? Poisoned wells? Bad air? Or the bathhouse? Doctors believed that hot water opened the pores and made the body vulnerable to miasma, the poisoned air of disease. Suddenly, washing was seen not as cleansing, but as fatal. Bathhouses, once centers of life, were shut down. Whole families abandoned bathing altogether, convinced that dirt itself acted as a shield against sickness. But here is the forbidden truth. Beneath the accusations of disease, another battle was being fought, one of power and control. Bathhouses were not just places of washing. They were hubs of information, where merchants made deals, nobles plotted alliances, and commoners mingled with elites. In some cities, they doubled as brothels or meeting places for heretical groups. By condemning bathing, the church didn't just fight disease, dismantled spaces of independence. Silence, separation, and filth were safer for authority than gatherings of free minds in warm water. Archaeological digs in London, Prague, and Cologne confirmed this forgotten story. Layers of soot and ash revealed public bathhouses abruptly abandoned. Drainage pipes clogged with coins, jewelry, and even carved amulets suggest they were sealed in haste. In one excavation, parchment fragment was found in a collapsed bathhouse wall. Its Latin text, a sermon warning against the sins of steam in chambers. Could this be evidence of deliberate suppression? The deeper you look, the stranger the story becomes. Nobles did not abandon cleanliness completely, while peasants wore filth as protection. Kings and queens turned to perfumes, scented cloths, and spiced oils. In France, records show that nobles were encouraged to dry bathe, rubbing themselves with linen instead of washing. In England, Queen Elizabeth I famously declared she bathed once a month, whether she needed it or not. Cleanliness had become symbolic, a matter of fragrance and fabric, not water. But what about the monasteries? Behind stone walls, monks lived under strict rules. Early monastic orders bathed regularly, seeing cleanliness as purity before God. But by the late Middle Ages, regulations shifted. Some monasteries banned more than 3 baths per year, claiming that frequent washing led to vanity. In certain abbeys, communal bathing was still practiced. Shared tubs, shared cloths, shared sponges. And here, another suppressed truth emerges. Outbreaks of disease often began in these abbeys. One 15th century Italian physician warned in his notes that the cloth of the privy and the bath spreads death from brother to brother. Weeks later, he was dead. His work was buried. His name erased. And yet, the whispers never died. In Germany, poems mocked nobles who bathed in silk and perfume, while peasants rot in husk. In Florence, city records outlawed the dumping of parchment scraps into waste pits, suggesting that even banned manuscripts sometimes found their final use in privies and baths. Was this a way to erase heresy, to wipe away forbidden texts, literally and symbolically? Consider this. If heretical manuscripts, censored prophecies, or even banned medical treatises ended up in bathhouses or cesspits, what better way to humiliate and erase dangerous knowledge? To wash it away, to let it rot in filth. The suppression of bathing was not only about health or sanit, it was about control of knowledge. Now, let's widen our lens. In the Islamic world, bathing was sacred. Hammams were built into mosques, where washing was part of faith. In China, nobles used fragrant soaps and herbal baths centuries before Europe. The contrast is striking. Civilizations that embraced water thrived in health and learning, while medieval Europe clung to silence. perfume, and superstition. The rejection of bathing was not inevitably, was chosen, enforced, and defended. And this leads us to the heart of the conspiracy. Why did Europe, of all places, abandon the very element that sustains life? Because it served the narrative of power. Filth could be rebranded as humility. Cume could disguise neglect, okay? And plague could be explained as divine wrath rather than human failure. To admit otherwise, to admit that disease spread through dirt, rags, and silence would be to admit that the church and the nobility had let their people die needlessly. It's better to blame water and erase the truth. By the 16th century, the tide began to turn. Renaissance physicians rediscovered ancient Roman texts praising bathing, but centuries of fear lingered. Even into the 18th century, some Europeans still avoided baths, convinced that dirt itself kept them alive. Only with the rise of modern science and sanitation did water reclaim its place as life, not death. And yet, fragments of that forgotten fear remain. In old proverbs warning against too much washing, in whispers that plague was punishment rather than neglect, in the vanished manuscripts of physicians who dared to say otherwise. So, what if it is all true? What if medieval bathing habits were not just trivia, but evidence of how power rewrote the body itself? What if suppression of water was a tool to control, silence, and divide? And what if hidden in the ashes of old bathhouses lies the proof that entire civilizations were kept dirty, not by choice, but by decree? The next time you step into a shower, think of the peasants who went years without washing, the nobles who dabbed perfume on filth, the monks who shared rags until death spread from hand to hand. Remember that cleanliness, like history, is never neutral. It is shaped by power, by fear, and by secrets buried in forgotten archives. History may not be what you were told. It never is, and I will leave you with this. If history could be rewritten once even in something as intimate as the act of bathing could happen again, subscribe now, because truth, no matter how buried, always finds its voice. What if I told you that medieval people didn't eat breakfast at all, and that when they finally did eat, it wasn't tea in the morning? Before we unlock this forbidden truth, hit subscribe, like, and drop a comment about what you eat for breakfast today, because the story you're about to hear is not just about food. It is about control, about secrets, and about the history they buried in archives they never wanted you to see. Picture this. The year is 1320. Dawn breaks in a muddy village. The air is cold, damp, heavy, with the stench of manure and wood smoke. The rooster crows, but no one stirs toward food. Instead, men and women shuffle out to work, hungry, their stomachs aching. The peasant picks up his plow, the woman hauls water, the children gather firewood, a bowl of barley gruel or hard bread, one tea-cum until the sun is high. The village bell tolls not to invite food, but to summon prayer. You see, in the Middle Ages, to eat early was not merely frowned upon, it was forbidden, condemned as weakness, as sin. Why? Because of medieval Kia. Europe food was never just food. It was politics. It was theology. It was control. The church taught that eating before morning prayers was gluttony. Tommy, nobles, and clergy declared that strong men must endure hunger before labor. Only children, the sick and outcasts, ate. Early a hungry peasant was obedient, his will bent, his body disciplined. And so Europe fasted through its mornings, not because there was no food, but because power demanded silence over hunger. We know this, not only from chronicles, but from suppressed documents hidden inside a 14th century household. Manual called the Book of Secrets appear strange marginal notes, while the main text discusses herbs and recipes. The margins warn against eating before terce, the third hour after sunrise, roughly 9 in the morning. Another warns, morning meals belong to infants and peasants, not men. These warranty. Simply medical beliefs, they were commandments woven into everyday life, disguised as wisdom. But here is where the conspiracy sharpens. In 1872, a scholar in Rome reported finding a Vatican letter from the 14th century. Its content was explosive. It instructed priests to forbid early meals, warning eating before prayer weakens fasting, emboldens disobedience, threatens the faith. His findings briefly appeared in print, then disappeared. His access to archives revoked his career, destroyed. Why censor a letter about breakfast unless breakfast itself threatened the order of things, unless controlling the first meal was a way of controlling the people themselves? And then came the Black Death between 1347 and 1351. Half of Europe perished, bodies stacked in carts, priests chanted over mass graves. Rumors spread. Did hunger weaken the body? Did fasting leave peasants too frail to fight disease? Whispers said yes. But the official story declared otherwise. Plague was divine punishment, not the result of filth or starvation. But fragments survived. In 1362, a monk known only as Frater L. wrote a desperate letter. He warned that silence on hygiene and food had killed millions. He begged for peasants to eat earlier to survive. His letter was redacted, censored, nearly lost. Why? Because admitting that food, not sin, determined survival would shatter the authority of the church. Archaeology gives us even darker proof. Excavations in medieval cesspits from London to Paris revealed traces of what people actually ate: coarse barley rye, beans, turnips, scraps of cheese, but not in the morning. Those pits show clear cycles of midday and evening meals. Meanwhile, noble cesspits reveal meats, wine, spices, and bread, sometimes linked to dawn feasting. The nobility broke the very rules they enforced. They feasted while peasants, starved. The divide between classes was etched not only in clothing and castles, but in the stomach. It was the hunger of millions that fueled the obedience of an empire. But here, the forbidden truth, other civilizations did not live this way. In China, records from the 6th century describe nobles eating rice, gruel, or steamed buns in the morning. In the Islamic world, food and water before. Prayer was not only allowed, but sacred, a ritual act of cleanliness and strength. In India, breakfast often began with lentils, rice, or flatbread. The difference is staggering. In the East, morning food was a gift. In Christian Europe, it was a crime. Why? This was not culture. This was control. Think about it. A hungry man prays harder. A hungry man questions less. A hungry man has no strength to rebel. By controlling when people ate, the church controlled how people thought. Obedience enforced not by swords, but by silence over bread. And yet, resistance appeared. A German poem from the 14th century mocked nobles who prayed with empty bellies, only to sneak food before dawn. An English ballad sneered at monks who preached hunger, but feasted in the shadows. City records from Florence even show laws forbidding bakers from opening before sunrise. Why pass such a law? Unless bakers were feeding people against the rules, unless the people were already rebelling with bread. But perhaps the most chilling clue lies in prophecy, one obscure medieval chronicle called Tist, the prophecy of the hours warned. When man eats when he wills, he will break his chains. But when he waits on bells, he is bound forever. Could this prophecy explain the silence? Could this be why manuscripts vanish? Could this be why historians dismiss breakfast as trivia? Because hidden inside trivia is revolution. To eat when you will is to live free. Till eat when commanded is to be ruled by the 16th century. Cracks began to appear. Coffee and sugar arrived from distant lands. Tea spread from China to Europe. Suddenly mornings smelled of steam and sweetness. The idea of breakfast returned not as invention, but as rebellion. Commoners began to eat bread with ale in the morning. Laborers demanded fuel before work. Nobles flaunted their wealth with feasts. At dawn, the church grip weakened. The bell no longer controlled the stomach. The first meal of the day became a symbol of freedom. But ask yourself this: how many lives were lost to centuries of silence? How many peasants fell in the fields from hunger? How many bodies succumbed to plague because they were denied the strength of food? Okay? And how much power was preserved because the people were too weak to resist? Today, we treat breakfast as ordinary: a bowl of cereal, a cup of coffee, toast with jam. But to medieval people, it was rebellion, a quiet act of defiance, a choice that could mark you as sinner or saint. It was the most political meal of the day. So the next time you eat in the morning, remember this: your simple meal is the freedom your ancestors were denied. It is liberty on a plate. It is survival against centuries of control. And it is a reminder that history is never just about what we are told. It is about what we are not allowed to know. And I'll leave you with this chilling thought. If history was rewritten once, even in something as ordinary as breakfast, what else could have been rewritten? 2. If the first meal of the day was suppressed for centuries, what other truths still lie buried in secret archives? Subscribe now, because truth, no matter how hidden, always finds its voice. What if I told you that in the Middle Ages drinking water could kill you on, that people avoided it at all costs? Before we dive into this forbidden truth, hit subscribe right now, because the history you're about to hear is the kind they buried in secret archives. A comment with what you think people drank instead, and like this video so the truth doesn't get erased again. Now, close your eyes and imagine it's the year 1325. You're in a medieval village, the streets muddy and narrow, lined with timber-framed houses leaning dangerously toward one another. The stench of animals, smoke, and rot hangs in the air. A church bell tolls in the distance. You walk to the village well, the heart of the community, where women and children gather with wooden buckets. The water glimmers faintly in the morning sun, but no one dares to drink it. Not the peasants, not the merchants, not even the priest who blesses it. Because here, water is death. Why? Because medieval water was far from pure. Wells were often shallow, dug near cemeteries or waste pits. Rivers ran dark with filth. Tanneries dumped toxic chemicals. Butchers poured animal blood into streams, and chamber pots were emptied from windows straight into flowing water. People washed clothes, animals drank freely, and diseases spread unseen. Without any knowledge of bacteria, people didn't know why water made them sick. They only knew that it did. So, instead of water, they turned to beer, ale, and wine-having children. The weak ale they drank daily wasn't meant to intoxicate, but to survive. Its brewing required boiling, which killed many of the invisible killers. Alcohol preserved it for longer, and herbs added flavor. Wine, especially in southern Europe, was the safer choice, and even peasants drank watered-down versions when they could afford it. To drink water was to risk your life. To drink ale or wine was to live. But this isn't just about survival. This is about power. The first clue comes from a little-known manuscript once kept in a French monastery, the Liberaco Vita, or Book of the Water of Life, written in the early 1300s. It warned that clear streams carry hidden death and urged people to boil water with rosemary, thyme, or honey. Yet the church condemned it, calling it dangerous speculation. Within a year, the manuscript disappeared, and the monk who wrote it was expelled. Some whispered he was poisoned. Why suppress simple advice about boiling water, lest knowledge itself was dangerous to those in power? Archaeology confirms what the texts hint at. Excavations of medieval cesspits in London and Paris uncovered jugs, mugs, and barrels filled with remnants of ale and wine, but almost no vessels clearly meant for water. Drinking water was nearly absent from medieval daily life. But here's the question no historian wants to ask. Was this simply cultural habit, or was it deliberate? Control of drink meant control of people. Monasteries produced massive quantities of beer. Nobles taxed alehouses. The church owned vineyards. If peasants learned that they could survive with nothing more than boiled water, the monopoly on survival would collapse. Beer and wine weren't just safer, they were profitable, and fear of water kept people dependent. Letters hidden in Vatican archives add weight to this suspicion. One from 1352, written during the Black Death, warned priests to condemn false cures of boiling water. It declared, "Let not man think he can cleanse what God has made unclean, lest he stray from his mercy." Translation: don't let peasants boil water, because survival comes only through divine blessings, symbolized by wine, controlled by the church. Sanitation became theology. Drinking became doctrine. But whispers of resistance surfaced. A German physician named Meister Gerhard secretly wrote pamphlets in 1370 teaching peasants to boil water with herbs. For a moment, people believed, but within months, Gerhard vanished. His name was erased. Only fragments of his notes survive in private collections today. How many others tried to speak in were silenced? This silence had consequences. Imagine a peasant family. The father drinks weak ale with bread. The mother brews beer in a small cauldron. The children sip from mugs of small beer every day. They never touch water. They don't even question why. Water's for washing, for animals, for the cursed poor who can't afford ale. To drink, it is shameful. And so, the cycle continues. In castles, the difference was even starker. Nobles enjoyed imported wines, spiced with cinnamon and cloves. Their banquets overflowed with goblets of red and white, while peasants at the foot of the hill clung to weak beer and hope. Water, even for the wealthy, was seen as primitive the drink of beasts, not men of refinement. In churches, priests preached that wine was holy, the blood of Christ, while water was earthly, tainted. Imagine the psychological power of that message. Salvation in one cup, damnation in the other. But here's the most chilling detail. Outside of Europe, people were drinking water safely in China. By the 6th century, tea had become central to life, not just as a drink, but as a health ritual. Why? Because tea required boiling water, which made it safe. In the Islamic world, water was tied to ritual purity. Cleanliness was part of faith. Wells and aqueducts were carefully maintained. Travelers described cities with flowing fountains, where water was sacred and safe to drink. Europe, by contrast, drowned in silence and filth. Why? Were Europeans less intelligent? Or were they prevented from learning the truth? Mainstream historians argue that people simply prefer beer and wine. But if that were true, why did manuscripts vanish? Why were physicians silenced? Why do pastoral letters condemn boiled water as heresy? Why did the church, which controlled vast vineyards and breweries, benefit so greatly from a population that feared the simplest drink of all? The truth may be that the greatest secret of medieval daily life wasn't tea about what people ate or were writ, was about what they couldn't. Tea, drink, water, the very essence of life, made forbidden. And think of the cost. The Black Death killed millions between 1347 and 1351. Was it truly divine punishment, as the church insisted? Or was it spread faster because of contaminated wells and rivers no one dared to purify? One whistleblower monk, known only as Frater L., wrote in 1362 that boiling water could slow the spread. His letter was redacted. His monastery burned. Imagine if Europe had listened. Would millions have lived? The conspiracy deepens when you realize the symbolism. Wine became sacred. Beer became survival. Water became death. And those who controlled the first to control life itself. The nobility and the church didn't just rule by sword or sermon. They ruled by thirst. Now, fast forward. When toilet paper was introduced, it represented civilization itself. When toothbrushes came, it represented hygiene. But when water finally became drinkable, purified, filtered, controlled, was nothing short of a revolution. For centuries, people have been denied the most basic truth, that boiling water could save them. When clean water finally flowed in cities, it shattered 1,000 years of silence. And here is the revelation. What if history's greatest conspiracy wasn't about wars or kings, but about thirst? What if water was deliberately forbidden to keep people dependent, to preserve wealth and power? What if generations lived and died in ignorance, not because they couldn't learn, but because they weren't allowed to? So the next time you pour a glass of water, crystal clear and safe, remember, it wasn't always this way. For centuries, water was the most dangerous drink in Europe. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't meant to be. Because history isn't what you were told. It rarely is. If truth could be buried once even, is something as basic as water, could it happen again? Subscribe now, because truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its voice. What if I told you that the shiny bottles of shampoo lining our modern shelves have almost nothing in common with how people in the Middle Ages washed their hair? In fact, what they used would disgust you. Before we begin, hit subscribe right now, because what you be about to hear is the kind of history they buried in forgotten manuscripts and secret archives, okay? And drop a comment with what you think they used, because the truth will surprise you. Picture this. The year is 1347. You're standing in a narrow medieval street. The stench of smoke, mud, and sweat pressing against you like a suffocating fog. A woman emerges from a cottage, her hair stringy and tangled. In her hands is not a bottle of shampoo, but a clay jug filled with stale ale mixed with crushed herbs. She tips it over her head, the sour smell filling the air, while her children laugh at the absurdity of it. This was hair care in the Middle Ages, and as strange as it sounds, beer was only the beginning. The first clue comes from a forgotten 14th century household manuscript, once stored in the private collection of a monastery and only rediscovered in the early 20th century. In its margins, a monk had scribbled a peculiar recipe. Take ashes of birch, mix with water and herbs of sage, apply to the head for luster. Imagine that, ashes soot, burned wood drubbed directly into hair. To medieval people, this wasn't dirt, it was medicine. I believed ashes cleansed the scalp of evil humors and absorbed oils, but in reality, it left hair gritty, foul-smelling, and dry, okay? Other recipes are worse. Archaeologists, analyzing residue in old wooden combs from London cesspits, discovered traces of animal fats, lye, and even urine. Yes, urine, collected in clay jars, aged until it turned into ammonia, then mixed with herbs or oils to brighten hair. To us, it sounds revolting, but in the logic of the Middle Ages, this was science. Ammonia strips grease. It cleans, but it also burns, damages, and leaves behind a stench that clung to hair like smoke on cloth. And here lies the darker truth. Not everyone suffered equally. Hygiene in the Middle Ages was a battlefield between class, poverty, and power. Peasants washed their hair with whatever they could find: ashes, mud, moss, or the runoff from rivers polluted with waste. Meanwhile, nobles experimented with rosemary water, rose oil, or imported spices dissolved in wine. In royal courts, servants boiled herbs and flower petals, straining the water into perfumed basins so their masters could soak their hair in luxury. Class difference was written not just in clothing or food, but in the very smell of your scalp. But this story grows stranger when we peer into monasteries. As records show, monks shared communal combs, and sometimes even communal hair-washing rags. A 15th century Italian physician warned that this practice spread lice and disease, urging abbots to forbid it. Weeks later, he mysteriously died. His warnings vanished from later manuscripts. Once again, the evidence of danger was silenced. Why? Because hygiene was not simply about cleanliness, it was about obedience. Silence kept monasteries in control. And then, a chilling discovery. In cesspits beneath medieval cities, Fragments of parchment have been uncovered, pages from manuscripts once considered heretical. Some were found stained with fatty residues and hair strands. Historians suggest that banned texts, whether Templar records, Cathar Gospels, or prophetic manuscripts, were sometimes torn up and used as hair-washing cloths. Imagine the humiliation. Sacred knowledge reduced to a rag for greasy hair. Was this accident or deliberate erasure? To wash away forbidden words, quite literally. Outside Europe, the story takes a different turn. In the Islamic world, hair care was tied to ritual cleanliness. Recipes included natural oils, henna, and perfumed rinses, methods that not only cleaned but nourished the hair. In China, rice, water, and herbal infusions were used, centuries ahead of European practices, while Christian Europe silenced conversations about the body. Other civilizations embraced cleanliness as both health and faith. So why was Europe different? Because the church preached that vanity was a sin. To wash your hair too often, to perfume it, to shine it, was to tempt pride. Many clerics warned that focusing on the body distracted from the soul. Some monasteries even banned the frequent washing of hair entirely, declaring it an indulgence of the flesh. The result? Generations lived with lice, dandruff, infections, and sores, all while being told it was holy. But what if the story we've been told is incomplete? Mainstream historians laugh off these recipes as trivia. Peasants used ashes, nobles used oils. But why then do entire manuscripts on medieval hygiene disappear from archives? Why do Vatican documents mention only vague, unclean acts, but never describe what was forbidden? And why did a 1362 pastoral letter, uncovered by a whistleblower monk known only as Frater L., warn priests not to discuss the washing of the head, lest the faithful seek remedies of man instead of the mercy of God? Once again, silence was enforced. Think of what that means. To admit that urine, ashes, and animal fat damaged health would be to admit negligence. To admit that perfumes and oils could prevent lice or infections would be to admit that nobles had knowledge denied to peasants. To admit that hygiene mattered would be to admit that the plague, the Black Death itself, was worsened by filth, not divine wrath. Silence served power, and hair something as ordinary as hair was caught in the middle. So, what did medieval shampoo look like? A foul mixture of superstition, desperation, and inequality. Peasants rubbed mud into their hair. Nobles perfumed their heads with rosemary steeped in wine. Monks shared rags soaked in ashes. Scattered among them all are whispers of forbidden knowledge, silenced because it threatened the narrative of sin and punishment. Now, here is the revelation. If something as small as shampoo could be censored, what else has been erased? If manuscripts describing hair care vanished, what other knowledge about medicine, about science, about survival was buried in cesspits and burned in monastery fires? If history was rewritten in something as trivial as washing your hair, what about the history of plagues, of power, of truth itself? So the next time you open a bottle of shampoo, remember this: it is not just a convenience, it is the result of centuries of lost experiments, buried manuscripts, and silenced voices. It is the luxury our ancestors never had. And maybe, just maybe, it is a reminder that history is not always what we were told. If history was rewritten once even, and the dirt of hair can be rewritten again, subscribe, because truth, no matter how filthy or buried, always finds its voice. What if I told you, God, that in the Middle Ages, people told time without clocks, not just with the sun, but with methods so bizarre, so forgotten, that they were erased from official records? Before we uncover this forbidden truth, hit subscribe, drop a comment with how you think they told time, and like this video, because history, no matter how hidden, always finds its voice. Imagine it is the year 1310. You live in a medieval village. There are no ticking clocks, no bells on your wrist, not even a calendar hanging on your wall. Time is not a number. It is a shadow stretching across stone, the faint burn of a candle, or the hollow sound of a church bell echoing through the fog. You wake when the rooster crows. You eat when the sun is high. You pray when the bells demand it. But behind this simple rhythm lies a dark truth. Time itself was a weapon, controlled by those in power. One of the earliest methods was the candle clock. Imagine a thick beeswax candle, carved with markings. Each line represented a slice of an hour. As the wax melted, the flame descended. In some monasteries, nails were pressed into the wax, and as the candle burned down, the nails clattered onto metal trays, ringing out like the strike of a clock. To us, it seems ingenious. But in the Middle Ages, such inventions were whispered about with suspicion, because whoever measured time outside the church risked being branded a heretic. Another strange method was the water clock, or clepsydra. In certain monasteries, jars were filled with water, dripping drop by drop into lower bowls. Priests watched as the levels rose, marking hours of prayer. But not all water clocks were holy. In the ruins of medieval villages, archaeologists found primitive bowls scorched black with fire, used by peasants who boiled water to control its drip speed. These weren't just tools, they were acts of defiance, because the church claimed ownership over time. Every bell, every hour belonged to them. To tell time independently was to rebel. Then there were the shadow clocks. Villagers carved crude sundials into the stone walls of churches and taverns. Some etched symbols into the very ground so they could track the length of a shadow across the dirt. But here's the forbidden twist. Many of these sundials were aligned not to the sun alone, but to the stars. Some scholars claim peasants used the rising of Sirius, or the constellation Orion, to mark the changing hours of night. This secret knowledge was condemned as dangerous, a gateway to astrology, even witchcraft. And then, the strangest of all time, told through the body. In monastery rules, it is written that monks should measure hours by the number of prayers whispered or psalms recited. In some abbeys, monks stretched their arms out in the dark, using the rhythm of their heartbeat to keep count. But one forgotten physician wrote in 1382 that peasants, too, used their own bodies, timing chores by how long it took to walk across fields, or how long bread took to rise by the fire. Time was breath, time was hunger, time was blood. But why did this matter? Because in the Middle Ages, controlling time was controlling life itself. The church divided the day into canonical hours: matins, before dawn; prime in the early morning; terce at mid-morning; sext at noon; vespers at sunset. Villagers lived by these bells. Work stopped. Prayers began. Meals were taken when the church declared. Even kings bound to the bell towers. To question this order was to question God. Yet fragments of suppressed documents hint at something darker. A Vatican manuscript, redacted in the 14th century, warned priests to guard against false hours being spread among the people. What were these false hours? Some claimed they were alternate systems of timekeeping, methods passed down from pagan traditions, using stars and seasons, not bells. Others whispered that the Cathars and Templars used their own sacred hours, timed by hidden devices, now lost to history. If true, this would mean entire secret societies defied the church, not just in belief, but in the very ticking of time. And here's where the conspiracy deepens. Why do so many medieval household manuals speak of cooking by shadows or brewing by candle marks? Yet entire chapters of these texts vanish in later copies. Why were the designs of early water clocks destroyed, their makers silenced? In one case, a scholar in Paris who lectured on candle clocks was tried for heresy. His notes disappeared from university archives, his name erased. Why? Because to own time was to own power. And power was not for the people, but imagine the daily life this created. A peasant wakes in the gray dawn, not knowing the hour, only that the bells have not yet rung. He lights a candle marked with scratches, praying it lasts until his work is done. A monk kneels in the dark, counting his prayers, uncertain if he is too fast or too slow. A nobleman demands wine at terce, while his servants scramble to guess if the shadow is long enough. In the Middle Ages, time itself was uncertain, flexible, and terrifyingly fragile. And yet, whispers survive. A German poem mocks the church. Your bells ring, not for God, but for power. We follow the sun, while you follow lies. 10 Florence. City records show fines against bakers who sold bread outside of proper hours. Proof that even markets ran on controlled time. And in England, sundials carved on church doors, known as mass dials, still remain, their lines worn but clear. They are ghosts of a world where people fought to measure life for themselves. So what if it's all true? What if medieval timekeeping wasn't quaint or primitive, but dangerous? What if the story of clocks is not about invention, but about control? What if the reason so many documents were redacted, so many scholars silenced, was because time itself was forbidden knowledge? Think of what that means. Every second you live today is counted by a system. Calendars, hours, minutes, inherited not from nature, but from power. The medieval peasant, looking at the stars, may have been freer than we are now, bound by our devices. History may not be what you were told. It never is. So I'll leave you with this. If time itself could be rewritten once, could it happen again? Subscribe now, because truth, no matter how long it's buried, always finds its voice. What if I told you that the Black Death, the deadliest pandemic in recorded history, was in tea, just a work of rats and fleas, as we've been taught? What if one of the greatest killers of mankind wasn't brought on by nature alone, but by an innocent medieval habit? A ritual so ordinary that no one thought twice about it. It's a daily act that may have unleashed a storm of death across Europe. Think about that for a second, because what I'm about to tell you changes the way we understand not only the plague, but medieval life itself. And before I reveal this hidden truth, make sure you subscribe right now, because this is the kind of forbidden history no textbook will teach you, and the more of us that know it, the harder it will be to bury again. It is the year 1347. Galleys arrive in Messina, Sicily, their sailors either dead or dying. Within days, black sores bloom on the skin of anyone they touch. Panic spreads faster than sickness. Cities fall silent before the cries of the dying and the tolling of church bells. In just a few short years, nearly half of Europe will be gone, whole villages erased, monasteries emptied, families wiped from existence. We're told the cause was simple: rats carrying fleas, fleas carrying Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind the plague. But this explanation, while comforting in its neatness, is incomplete. It ignores something far stranger. Hidden in monastic records, city ordinances, and even archaeological evidence is a chilling reality. The plague was accelerated, not just by vermin, but by the very way medieval people lived. Imagine a medieval home, small, smoky, dim, a single bed of straw in the corner. The entire family, parents, children, sometimes even neighbors, piled together in the same bedding. Privacy was unknown. Space was scarce. In noble houses, servants sometimes slept at the foot of their masters' beds. In monasteries, brothers shared cots or swapped garments and blankets. This was no act of negligence, it was survival. Fabric was expensive. Wool was treasured. Linen scarce. Clothes were worn until they literally rotted off the body. So they were passed along from parent to child, brother to brother, master to servant. But these shared beds and shared garments were alive. They crawled with lice and fleas, perfect carriers of plague. By the time one person in a household showed symptoms, the insects had already feasted on everyone else. The innocent act of lying down to sleep became a death sentence. Archaeologists today have dug deep into plague sites. What they found is disturbing. Bedding filled with straw, blackened by age, still riddled with the microscopic remains of parasites. Wooden coffins packed, not with a single skeleton, but with whole families, buried together, an eerie sign that they died within days of one another. In one dig near Lübeck, Germany, scientists discovered preserved lice in the seams of medieval tunics. The insects still carried plague DNA. This means plague wasn't just a rat-borne disease. It was quite literally woven into the fabric of medieval life. Every shirt, every blanket, every communal rag was a potential killer. And here is where it grows darker. Physicians of the age noticed the connection. Italian medical texts mention the crawling things of cloth as dangerous. One even warned that the evil rides in garments, in the fibers of wool, in the straw of beds. Yet these manuscripts were quietly suppressed, so physicians who wrote too plainly about filth and fleas died mysteriously, or their works vanished from records. Why? Because the church and nobility could not afford for the people to know the truth. To admit that poor hygiene and communal living spread the disease was to admit that the plague was not divine punishment, but a man-made disaster of ignorance. If peasants realized this, fear of God's wrath would no longer control them. Better, then, to tell them it was a scourge from heaven. Better to preach repentance, confession, and obedience. And yet, communal bedding was not the only habit that spread death. There were other rituals, stranger still, that turned homes into coffins. Families burned herbs, dung, and wood indoors, sealing their homes against the miasma of bad air. They thought this smoke would cleanse sickness. In truth, it trapped fleas inside the room, ensuring that everyone was bitten. In monasteries, communal rags were used in privies and washed for reuse. To the brothers, this was an act of humility and simplicity. To fleas and lice, it was a highway of infection. Italian doctors warned about this practice, warnings that were ignored until the monasteries themselves lay silent. The faithful flocked to shrines, kissing relics and drinking from shared cups. Pilgrims pressed shoulder to shoulder, coughing, sweating, weeping. The church encouraged these gatherings, insisting that piety would shield believers. Instead, they became super-spreader events. Why is this never taught? Because history is written by those who need to protect their power. The chronicles that survived were often penned by monks who framed the plague as divine punishment. Tales about filth, lice, or shared bedding were trimmed away. Whole sections of civic records in Florence and Avignon were destroyed. Accords that may have shown authorities knew exactly how disease spread. Even later historians preferred the simpler story: rats, fleas, and fate. It was neater, less damning, less human. To say otherwise is to admit that millions died not only because of nature, but because of choices, habits, and silence. And yet, hints survive. French poet ridiculed nobles who wore silk upon sores, spreading death with vanity. A physician in Lübeck wrote, "The beast is not only the rat, but the lice of garments, the fleas of bedding." Florence passed laws banning the sale of second-hand clothes during the height of plague years. A law so strict that sellers were hanged for disobedience. Why such fear of clothing, unless it was known to kill? These fragments point to a suppressed truth. Plague was not simply carried by rats into Europe. It was amplified by the way humans lived, the way they slept, the way they touched. The very closeness that kept them warm in the cold also brought them to the grave. So what does this mean for us today? It means that history is not just a story of events. It's a story of what is hidden. Entire populations were sacrificed, not only to disease, but to ignorance, carefully maintained by those in power. And perhaps most haunting, if history could be rewritten once, To hide the truth of the plague, could it not be rewritten again in our own time? The Black Death wasn't just a natural disaster. It was, in many ways, man-made. Born from innocence, from daily ritual, from habits no one thought to question. The plague rode not only on rats, but on rags, on straw, on smoke, on silence. So the next time you hear the neat, tidy story of the Black Death, remember what was erased, the medieval habit that accidentally spread death. And remember, too, that truth, no matter how deeply buried always, claws its way back to the surface. Subscribe, because I promise, youth, this is only the beginning. What if I told you that in the Middle Ages, men and women walked the streets in shoes so absurdly long, so impractical, that they reached over 2 feet past the toes, shoes that made stairs a challenge running impossible, and kneeling in prayer a farce? You'd think it was just fashion, right? A medieval joke? But the deeper you look, the stranger it gets. Okay, these shoes weren't simply about style. They were about power, corruption, hidden symbolism, and maybe even censorship. Before we dive in, hit subscribe right now, because the story you're about to hear is one the history books laugh off. It's one the church denounced as sinful, one kings tried to legislate away, and yet one that hides a chilling truth. Drop a comment with how long you dare wear shoes like these and like this video so the truth dose and tea get buried again. Close your eyes and imagine Paris, 1382. The streets stink of smoke and sewage. Merchants shout their prices. Bells toll from Notre Dame. And then your gaze falls on the nobles parading through the square. Their robes trail the ground, their heads held high, and at their feet, shoes, plants leather monstrosities, curling to razor points, extending like knives, some stretch past the length of a man's arm. People whisper, laugh, even curse under their breath. But no one dares question too loudly, 'cause here's the thing, pool lanes weren't just a joke, they were status. Nobles flaunted them as proof they didn't need to labor, didn't need to run, didn't need practicality. A peasant had to chop wood, herd animals, till fields. Try doing that in shoes 2 feet long, you'd break your ankle in minutes. These shoes were fashioned as control, wealth displayed in the most impractical way possible. And yet, it goes deeper. The first clue lies in an English statute from 1463 under King Edward IV, limiting commoners' shoes to 2 inches beyond the toes. Nobles, however, faced no such restriction. The law wasn't about practicality, it was about drawing a line. Shoes became a weapon of class warfare, forcing everyone to know their place with every step, but priests hated them. In sermons, poulains were denounced as the devil's claw. Some clerics insisted their pointed shape symbolized lust, arrogance, and sin. One fiery preacher in Florence called them the horns of pride worn on the feet. In Poland, where the fashion began, chroniclers note that the first to wear them were knights connected to the Teutonic Order, a secretive military brotherhood. And here's where the whispers start. Some say the long points weren't just for show, they were coded messages. In certain circles, the length of a man's palain allegedly revealed his status in a hidden hierarchy, perhaps even membership in secret fraternities. The shoe became a uniform, visible only to those who knew how to read its meaning. Still think that sounds far-fetched? Consider this. Archaeologists digging cesspits in medieval London discovered poulains stuffed with parchment scraps. When pieced together, some fragments contained not random notes, but heretical writings, sermons condemning corruption in the church. Why hide manuscripts inside shoes? Is it recycling, leather padding, or smuggling censored texts beneath the feet of the elite? Imagine nobles walking through plague-ridden streets, each stride trampling forbidden knowledge, heresy literally underfoot. And then there's the plague itself. During the Black Death, these shoes may have become silent killers. Physicians warned nobles that the long, dragging points picked up filth, human waste and infected blood, spreading disease into homes and courts. In one chilling 1350 letter, a physician pleaded for the ban of poulains, calling them the devil's spoons of death. Weeks later, the physician vanished from records. His writings disappeared. Was he silenced for daring to blame noble fashion for plague deaths? But this wasn't just about health, it was about ritual. In suppressed chronicles from German abbeys, monks described secret gatherings of the Brethren of the Long Shoe, men whose points curved upward, as if reaching for heaven or mocking it. In one account, their shoes were said to be measured before entering the chamber, the longest earning the highest honor. Was this a parody or initiation? The fact that the record was censored suggests someone didn't want it preserved. And here's the darkest whisper. Some nobles supposedly used their poulains to conceal blades. The extended tip could hide a slender dagger, turning fashion into a weapon. There are reports of duels in which a fatal strike came not from a sword, but from a sudden kick, the shoe's point piercing like steel. Authorities dismissed these as rumors. But again, why suppress it if it were only a rumor? Let's also remember symbolism. In medieval art, devils and demons were often depicted with twisted claws and curling feet. Now look again at the poulains. Curved, sharp, grotesque were nobles mocking faith or proclaiming allegiance to something darker. When priests thundered that Satan enters through vanity, were they speaking metaphorically or literally? And think about this. Peasants trudged barefoot or in simple boots, while nobles hobbled in useless extensions. Every step was theater. Poulains turned, walking itself into a spectacle of power. I do not labor, I do not run, I do not stoop, I glide above you. Fashion became propaganda, and propaganda became controlled. Even laws reflected this. In Venice, a sumptuary law declared that women of ill repute could not wear poulains. Why? Because their shoes blurred class lines. The elite feared not the absurdity of the shoes, but their democratization. The shoe wasn't about walking, it was about marking who was allowed to be seen. And then the manuscripts. In one Florentine archive, a law from 1394 forbade the disposal of parchment into cesspits. Why ban this unless it was happening often? And where do we find parchment fragments? In poulains, again and again, as forbidden texts, hidden in fashion, lost to filth. Could it be that some of Europe's most dangerous heretical writings were erased not by fire, but by being trampled beneath noble feet? Here's where the conspiracy sharpens. Look at the timeline. Poulains peak in the late 14th century, right as the church cracks down on heresy, burns the Templars, hunts the Lollards, silences reformers. At the same time, nobles flaunt absurd shoes, while fragments of banned manuscripts vanish into cesspits. Coincidence or cover-up? Because here's the chilling thought. What if those shoes were never just fashion? What if they were a distraction? Imagine plague, famine, revolt spreading across Europe. What better way to keep nobles obsessed with status than absurd shoes while silencing dissent underfoot? What better way to hide dangerous texts than inside leather curled like a claw? And so, I ask you, were poulains ridiculous fashion or a ritual? Or a weapon or censorship? The truth is likely all of it. The shoe became a battlefield of class, faith, secrecy, and disease. Every stride is a statement. Every point is a symbol. Every fragment stuffed inside a whisper of knowledge erased. So the next time you see a medieval painting of nobles in absurd shoes, don't laugh. Look harder. Ask what secrets they're hiding. And ask yourself, if people could be controlled by shoes in the Middle Ages, what controls us today under the guise of just style? Subscribe, because in our next forbidden story, we'll uncover something even more chilling. Not what nobles wore on their feet, but what they carried in their hands. What if I told you that in the Middle Ages, peasants didn't just live with their animals, they actually slept beside them in the same room, sometimes even in the same bed. Before you laugh or cringe, hit subscribe right now, because what you're about to hear isn't just about poverty or warmth. It's about a dark, forbidden truth that rulers, priests, and chroniclers buried for centuries. And when you find out why, it will change the way you think about medieval life forever. Picture this: a small, smoky hut on a cold night in the year 1327. The roof is low, the walls are crooked, and the floor is dirt. In one corner lies a mother, her children curled against her, pressed right beside them is a pig, grunting softly. Near the door, a cow chews lazily, her warm breath clouding the air. Chickens roost on a beam just above the bed. This was not unusual. In fact, for most medieval peasants, this was life. Why? Historians will tell you the simple answer: warmth. The body heat of animals helped peasants survive brutal winters. But that explanation is far too neat, far too clean. Because hidden in monastic manuscripts and archaeological finds is a far stranger story. One that hints at survival, yes, but also disease, power, and control. The first clue comes from a 14th century English text known as the Husbandman's Guide. In it, the scribe notes, "The cow in the home keeps hunger from the door. The pig at the hearth keeps the child alive." At first, it sounds like a proverb about survival, but in the margins, another hand added, "And the beasts keep men obedient." Obedient to whom? To what? Digging deeper, we find more troubling signs. Ecologists excavating medieval homes in York discovered layers of animal dung mixed directly with human living spaces. But alongside this filth, they found charms carved from bone, scraps of parchment, and symbols of protection. Seems that peasants didn't just share space with animals, okay? They may have believed the animals guarded them from evil spirits. Some scholars suggest this was no mere superstition. The church often condemned beast magic rituals where pigs, goats, or even chickens were used in protective rites. By forcing peasants into close quarters with their animals, landlords and priests could blur the line between survival and sin. If you relied too much on your pig for warmth or protection, were you a Christian or a heretic? And here's where the story gets darker. Records from the 15th century tell of trials where peasants were accused of witchcraft for whispering charms to their cows or for laying with pigs at night. Punishments were brutal. But behind these accusations lies something more sinister: control. Peasants depended on animals for warmth, milk, or protection. They could be accused of sin at any time. This gave the church power over even the most private act of survival: how you slept. But disease was the hidden cost. Sleeping beside animals meant fleas, lice, and parasites spread freely between human and beast. The Black Death itself, the plague that wiped out half of Europe, spread partly because fleas from rats and livestock found easy hosts in human homes. And yet, curiously, chronicles from the time rarely mention this obvious connection. Instead, they speak of divine wrath. Why? Because to admit the truth that cramped, filthy living spread death would be to admit negligence and failure by the very elites who allowed such conditions. Even more shocking is a note from a Benedictine monk in 1372. He wrote, "In the hut of the peasant, the pig is his blanket, the cow his guardian, the hen his clock." But then, almost in warning, he adds, "Beware, for in their slumber, man and beast become one, and the line of nature is crossed." What did he mean? Was it merely about hygiene, or was he hinting at something more taboo? Because another suppressed manuscript, locked away in the Vatican archives until the 19th century, describes peasants accused of sharing their beds too closely with animals. The language is vague, but suggestive. And perhaps this was part of the reason church authorities were so eager to regulate peasant living habits, because the closeness of man and beast was seen as unnatural, even dangerous to the social order. But beyond scandal and fear, there's another layer to this mystery. Animals in medieval homes weren't just practical companions. They were symbols. The rooster was the morning alarm, crowing with the dawn. The pig was wealth, a living store of meat. The cow represented life itself, milk for children, strength for fields. By sleeping with animals, peasants weren't only keeping warm, they were weaving their lives into a cycle of survival, one the church and nobility sought to oversee, regulate, and exploit. And yet, whispers remain of another truth, that peasants sometimes preferred this life, that they saw animals as kin, not tools. In a German folktale, a farmer's soul is saved not by a priest, but by the loyalty of the ox who carried him through the night. In Slavic legend, pigs could sense demons and warned their owners. To the peasant, the animals weren't just warmth, they were protectors, family, sometimes even spiritual allies. So why was this story hidden? Why do our history books reduce it to a simple line? Peasants slept with animals for warmth and nothing more. 'Cause the real story is messy. It blurs the line between necessity and heresy, between survival and sin. It shows a church willing to accuse its poorest followers of witchcraft simply for staying alive. It reveals that the Black Death, that most terrifying plague, spread not by divine will, but by the enforced poverty and filth of medieval life. And so, the next time you picture a medieval village, don't imagine neat cottages and tidy farms. Picture smoke-filled huts where children slept pressed against pigs, where cows breathed warmth onto tired families, where chickens stirred above the bed. Picture lives lived on the edge of survival, but also on the edge of accusation, control, and fear. And here, as the forbidden question, what if the church didn't just tolerate these conditions, but relied on them? What if keeping peasants close to their animals kept them sick, dependent, and controllable? What if this wasn't just poverty, but policy? History may never give us a clear answer, but what we do know is this: when you strip away the myths, when you dig into the filth of cesspits and the margins of old manuscripts, you find a truth that is far stranger, is far darker than anything you were taught in school. So the next time you tuck yourself into a clean bed, think of those peasants, their pigs, their cows, their chickens, and ask yourself, if history was rewritten once, even in something as basic as where we slept, could it happen again? Subscribe now, because truth, no matter how buried, always finds its voice. What if I told you that medieval people didn't use toilet paper at all, and that what they used instead will shock you to your core? Before we uncover this forbidden truth, hit subscribe right now, because the stories you're about to hear are the kind they buried in secret archives. Drop a comment with what you think they used, and like this video to make sure the truth doesn't get buried again. Now, let's step back into a world that smelled of fire, mud, and disease. A world where sanitation wasn't a convenience, but a battlefield between class, poverty, and power. Imagine it is the year 1348. You're in a medieval village. Streets are narrow and suffocating. Pigs and dogs wander freely. Children play among piles of refuse. Chamber pots are emptied straight into the gutters. You pull your cloak close against the cold air, heavy with smoke and rotting waste. When nature calls, you duck behind a leaning wooden shack. There is no roll of paper, no cotton, nothing soft or clean waiting. Instead, you reach for what every man, woman, child reached for in those century straw, sharp husks, brittle leaves, moss damp from a stream. If you were lucky, perhaps a rag. If not, maybe even a seashell. This was daily life in the Middle Ages, but hidden inside these details is a truth far darker than trivia. This story isn't just about filth, it's about survival, class, and control. The first clue comes from an overlooked 14th century household manual known as the Book of Secrets. At first glance, it offers herbal remedies and cooking instructions, but in its margins, scribes added cryptic notes about daily habits. Scraps of wool used in noble houses, hay and moss in peasant huts, pages torn from old texts when nothing else was at hand. Think about that for a moment. Pages torn from old texts. Imagine a fragment of a manuscript or a piece of parchment from a discarded sermon, reduced to the final use of wiping away waste. This was not mere poverty. It was heresy. And yet, it happened often enough that the church issued warnings about the misuse of sacred parchment. But archaeology reveals an even stranger truth. In the 1970s, excavations in medieval London uncovered cesspits filled not only with bones, pottery, and waste, but with cloth rags bundled together, still stained centuries later. In some pits, fragments of seashells were found. Their edges are sharp, but worn with use. One historian published these shocking findings only to see his extended work vanish. He claimed institutions pressured him to stop. Why would medieval toilet habits need censorship, lest they revealed something much bigger? The truth is that hygiene in the Middle Ages was never equal. What you used after relieving yourself marked your class. Peasants scraped with straw, leaves, corn husks, or moss. Nobles used cloth, soft wool, or even imported linen. The wealthy even had servants tasked with preparing basins and clothes for their privy time. In royal courts, toilet cloths might be washed in scented water and reused, while peasants suffered bleeding and infection from rough materials. Nobles wiped in comfort. Sanitation was class warfare, written in straw and linen. But here lies the forbidden detail. In monasteries, the practice was often communal. Monks shared rags, sponges, or scraps washed and reused again and again. One 15th century Italian physician warned in his notes that this practice spread sickness through abbeys. He begged that communal clothes be banned. Weeks later, he died, his work suppressed, his name forgotten. Suppressed knowledge is itself a sign of conspiracy. If hygiene was so dangerous to speak of, why erase the record unless silence protected someone? And then we find the strangest whisper of all. Some records suggest that old manuscripts, sometimes destroyed by church decree, found their way into privies and cesspits. Scholars have uncovered fragments of parchment, script still legible, buried in medieval waste pits. Why would scripture end up there? Argue, peasants, desperate for soft parchment, tore what they could find. But others suggest another possibility. Heretical texts, outlawed writings, prophecies, and secret manuscripts may have been recycled into waste as both humiliation and erasure. Wipe away the knowledge. Wipe away the evidence. Literally. If that sounds far-fetched, remember, this was an age of censorship. Knowledge was dangerous. The Knights Templar were burned at the stake in 1314. Their archives seized, their books destroyed. Tales were wiped out in fire and war. The church erased entire traditions, and yet, fragments survive. Sometimes in the unlikeliest of places, even in cesspits, even in the margins of household manuals. But here is where the conspiracy deepens. Why was this story hidden? Mainstream historians laugh it off as trivia. Peasants used moss, nobles used cloth. But look closer. Why do entire centuries of household manuals vanish? Why do pastoral letters from bishops mention only vague acts of uncleanliness? And why did priests instruct their flocks not to discuss such matters publicly? The Black Death swept Europe, killing millions. The link between filth and death was undeniable. Yet, official chronicles spoke only of divine punishment, never sanitation. One redacted letter from 1362, covered by a Vatican whistleblower known only as Frater L., instructed priests to discourage talk of bodily hygiene, lest the faithful seek false remedies rather than the mercy of God. In other words, stay silent about what truly spread disease. Think of what that means, to admit that filth, straw, communal rags, and seashells helped spread plague would be to admit negligence, to admit the church and nobility let their people die in ignorance. Instead, the story was rewritten. Plague became divine wrath. Filth became normal. And the people remained silent, obedient, suffering, but never questioning. And yet, whispers remained. A French physician wrote of the evil that passes hand to hand in the cloth of the privy. This German poem mocked nobles who wipe in silk while peasants bleed in husk. In Florence, city records show laws against disposing parchment in waste pits. Why ban something unless it was happening often enough to matter? So what if it is all true? What if toilet practices were more than trivia? What if they reveal how class divided survival? How censorship erased science? Okay? How entire plagues were worsened by suppression of hygiene? Okay? What if fragments of heretical prophecy were literally wiped away, hidden in the most private act of human life? Let's push deeper. Outside Europe, the story looks very different. In China, records from the 6th century describe the use of paper sheets for hygiene by nobles centuries before the West adopted toilet paper. In the Islamic world, water was central to ritual cleanliness. Hygiene tied directly to faith. A stark contrast to Christian Europe where silence about the body reigned. Imagine the difference. Entire civilizations shaped by what they used after the most basic act of all. One civilization washed, another censored. One preserved health, another preserved silence and disease. And so, when toilet paper finally emerged in the West centuries later, it was not invention, it was revolution. It represented not just comfort, but a break from silence, from filth, from centuries of suffering. It was civilization itself, rolled into a single object. But here is the revelation. What if the history of sanitation is not just about survival, but about control? What if entire plagues could have been prevented if the truth had been admitted? What if the class divide between nobles with linen and peasants with straw was not an accident, but a system of hierarchy enforced even in the most private act? What if the reason manuscripts of hygiene vanished was because they contradicted the narrative of divine punishment and threatened to expose that the plague was not God's wrath, but man's neglect? So, the next time you hold a roll of toilet paper, remember, this is not just convenience. It is the luxury of truth itself. It is the comfort our ancestors never had because their knowledge was erased and their suffering rewritten. History may not be what you were told. It never is, right? And I'll leave you with this chilling thought. If history was rewritten once even in something as intimate as sanitation, could it happen again? Subscribe now, because truth, no matter how filthy or buried, always finds its voice. What if I told you that medieval people brushed their teeth without toothpaste and that the strange and sometimes horrifying things they used will shock you to your core? Before we uncover this forbidden truth, hit subscribe right now, drop a comment with your guess, okay? And like this video so the story doesn't get buried again, okay? Because what you're about to hear is one of those secrets they daren't teach in school. It's a hidden history that still lingers in the shadows of forgotten manuscripts and censored archives. Picture this. It is the year 1260. You are standing inside a smoky tavern in the heart of medieval England. The air is thick with the scent of roasted meat and sour ale. The floor is sticky with spilled drink, and a fire crackles in the hearth. If you look around the room at the faces of the people gathered there, some mouths are half-empty, teeth missing, gums blackened by decay. But others surprise you. Their teeth look clean, almost white, far better than you'd expect for an age without toothbrushes or toothpaste. How did they manage that? The answer isn't simple. It involves ashes, wine, herbs, powders made from bone and shellavin, disturbingly, human urine. These practices weren't random acts of desperation. They were deliberate choices, guarded remedies, and sometimes forbidden knowledge. And the deeper we dig, the more unsettling the story becomes. At first glance, modern historians dismiss the idea that medieval people cared much about hygiene. The stereotype is one of filth, rot, and neglect. Tells another story in the Taquinum Sanitatis, a 14th century health handbook. scribes carefully detailed recipes for powders made of sage, salt, and mint to cleanse the mouth. Some instructions mention using linen cloth dipped in wine vinegar, then rubbed along the teeth and gums to strip away buildup. A lost 12th century text from the medical school at Salerno describes grinding rosemary and mixing it with ashes to create a tooth cleaning powder. These weren't just peasant folk remedies. These were structured traditions, some preserved by noble families, others by monks inside monasteries. Yet, mysteriously, many of these recipes vanish in later copies, pages cut out, margins scraped clean, even entire chapters erased. It is almost as if someone wanted to destroy the knowledge of medieval dental care. One of the most shocking discoveries comes from the archives of a northern Italian monastery. Buried in a monk's personal notes was an unsettling practice: urinies, human urine use as a mouth rinse. As disturbing as it sounds, the ammonia found in urine acted as a natural whitener. It disinfected, killed bacteria, and even polished the teeth. In fact, records from ancient Rome suggest this practice was already known and sometimes continued into the medieval era. But here's the twist-later versions of the same texts deliberately erase all mention of it. Why? The church began warning against vanity, condemning those who sought beauty of the flesh. But could there have been another motive? Was this knowledge erased, not out of morality, but out of control? If people could preserve their health and appearance with simple remedies, they would be less dependent on the spiritual and medical authority of the church. Suppressing knowledge about hygiene wasn't about sin, it was about power. Consider the deeper truth here. The peasants, brushing wasn't vanity, it was survival. Rotting teeth often led to deadly infections. The poor turned to whatever was available. They chewed on twigs from ash or hazel trees, their frayed ends acting as primitive toothbrushes. Archaeologists excavating cesspits in medieval London have found these very sticks, one end worn smooth from chewing. Meanwhile, nobles enjoyed far more luxurious options. They crushed pearls into fine powder, mixing it with vinegar to polish their teeth. Some used imported spices like cloves or cinnamon to freshen their breath. Even in dental hygiene, class warfare was alive and well. Peasants' teeth rotted. Nobles smiled white. And those smiles weren't just vanity. They were symbols of superiority, of power displayed even through the mouth. But here's where the conspiracy runs deeper. Many of the most effective remedies, charcoal, herbal rinses, twigs, weren't European inventions. They were imported. During the Crusades, contact with the Islamic world exposed Europeans to new practices. In the Islamic Golden Age, hygiene was sacred. The miswak stick, made from the arak tree, was praised for centuries as a natural toothbrush, still used in some parts of the world today. Arab medical texts also described mouth rinses made with vinegar, salt, and herbs. Europeans brought these ideas home, but often in secret. Some nobles adopted them, some monks recorded them, but widespread use was suppressed, either out of pride, prejudice, or fear that foreign remedies would undermine the church's authority. Imagine the irony. While other civilizations openly embraced cleanliness, Europe wrapped the subject in silence and shame. The most chilling whispers come from the manuscripts of alchemists. Hidden inside coded symbols, alchemists embedded recipes for tooth powders disguised as experiments on metals. One such text, known as the Liber Albus, long thought to describe transformations of lead into silver, turned out to be a recipe: sage, ash, vinegar, ground seashell. A complete formula for oral cleansing, hidden in plain sight. Why hide it? Why encrypt dental care unless it was knowledge considered too powerful or too dangerous for common people to access? And yet mainstream historians still deny it. Squan, and they'll tell you peasants never brushed their teeth, that urine mouthwash is apocryphal, that powders of pearl and sage were rare curiosities. But then, why do multiple manuscripts across Europe include these recipes? Why do bishops' letters warn against the excessive cleansing of the mouth if no one was practicing it? Why do Vatican herbal treatises contain pages cut out exactly where recipes for tooth care might have appeared? Okay. The pattern is undeniable. This was not ignorance. It was censorship. Hygiene equaled autonomy, and autonomy was a threat. Now imagine the revelation. What if it's all true? What if medieval people not only brushed their teeth, but understood natural remedies long before us? What if their knowledge of herbs, minerals, and ash was deliberately erased to keep people reliant on prayer, confession, and expensive medical care? Think about the cesspits in London, where archaeologists found not only twigs, but fragments of cloth still stained with herbal powders. Think of the letters where priests condemned people for prideful cleansing. Think of the redacted pages in the Vatican's archives. This is not trivia. This is a story of control hidden in the most private act of daily life. And here's the chilling parallel. In China, as early as the 6th century, nobles were using paper not just for writing, but for hygiene. In the Islamic world, ritual cleanliness was tied to faith itself, ensuring the preservation of teeth and gums for centuries. Meanwhile, in Christian Europe, silence ruled. The body was shamed, the mouth ignored, and the people suffered, not out of ignorance, but out of design. By keeping their bodies frail and their mouths diseased, the ruling elite kept their spirits broken and their obedience assured. So the next time you pick up your toothbrush and squeeze out a line of minty toothpaste, remember this: it is not just hygiene, it is freedom. Hey, it is knowledge recovered after centuries of suppression. Medieval people brushed their teeth, but they brushed with ashes, herbs, bones, shells, twigs, and sometimes with substances too disturbing to name. And in doing so, they left behind fragments of a story someone wanted to bury. Redacted manuscripts, censored recipes, erased knowledge. History may not be what you were told, never is. They could rewrite something as small as brushing teeth. What else might have been rewritten? What greater truths are still buried in secret archives, hidden behind redacted pages, waiting for someone to uncover them? And I'll leave you with this thought. If knowledge about hygiene was silenced once, could it be silenced again? Subscribe now, because truth, no matter how filthy, no matter how forbidden, always finds its voice. Imagine pulling on your shirt in the morning. Instead of fabric brushing against your skin, you feel a small pouch filled with honey, blood, or rancid grease, strapped to your chest or hanging from your belt. It sounds disgusting, doesn't it? But in the Middle Ages, this wasn't a bizarre punishment or even a medical treatment. It was survival. Before we dive deeper, hit subscribe right now, because the story you're about to hear is one that was never meant to survive in the history books. The truth of how medieval people lived. The filth, the desperation, the terrifying creativity was often erased, dismissed, or ridiculed as mere superstition. But when you look closer, you discovered that these grotesque little details of daily life weren't nonsense at all. They were life and death. So let us step back into that world. A world where fleas were more feared than wolves, more dangerous than swords, and in many ways more powerful than kings. In the Middle Ages, fleas were everywhere. You couldn't escape them. They lived in your bedding, in your clothes, in the hay of your animals, and in the rushes that covered the floors of even noble halls. Every time you sat down, lay in bed, or walked through a street, fleas jumped onto you. And unlike lice, which were seen as merely irritating, fleas carried something far worse: disease. Kate. They were the invisible killers behind the Black Death, which in the mid-14th century wiped out as much as half of Europe's population. Imagine entire villages gone. Cities like Florence reduced to silence. And at the heart of it all, a parasite smaller than a grain of rice. People didn't know about bacteria or viruses, but they noticed patterns. They saw that fleas clung to fur, that sickness spread where fleas thrived, and that those who managed to keep themselves cleaner somehow fared a little better. And so, in the absence of modern science, they turned to something both ingenious and revolting: flea traps. The logic was simple. If fleas are drawn to blood, heat, sweat, and filth, why not give them an easier target than your own skin? So peasants, monks, and even nobles began to wear small cloth or leather pouches under their clothes. Inside these pouches were substances designed to lure fleas away. Some filled them with animal blood, others with honey, cheese, or spoiled meat. A few accounts even mentioned moss soaked in wine or clumps of hair taken from animals. A pouch would be strapped close to the body so that fleas already crawling on a person would smell the stronger lure and crawl inside. Once full, the pouch could be emptied into a fire, destroying the insects. In some monasteries, wool soaked in goat's blood was the preferred bait, tucked into sleeves or waistbands, then shaken out into the flames after prayers. For peasants, it was often cruder: a rag smeared with grease or rancid fat, queued around the ankle or stuffed into the hem of a tunic. If it reduced bites even slightly, it was worth the discomfort. Think of it: men, women, and children walking through the streets, carrying little sacks of rot and blood against their skin. The smell, the stickiness, the horror of it. But the alternative was worse: endless itching, infected bites, and the looming specter of plague. You might be wondering, did these traps really exist, or is this just rumor? The answer lies in the strange fragments of evidence that have survived. Archaeologists excavating medieval cesspits and trash layers in London and Paris have found scraps of cloth stained with what appears to be dried blood and grease. Some of these rags show stitching designed to form small pouches, and in one case, the cloth was found alongside the remains of fleas. Even more chilling are the manuscripts. In the margins of a 14th century medical text, a scribe added a note in Latin: "The vermin are drawn to blood, not thine own." Scholars believe this is one of the earliest written references to flea traps. And in the records of a Florentine physician, complaint survives. He begged monks to stop reusing communal wool pads soaked in blood, warning that they spread the invisible sickness through abbeys. Weeks later, the physician himself died, and his warnings were conveniently forgotten. It's like almost everything in the Middle Ages. Flea traps weren't equal. Peasants used rags, grease, straw, and whatever foul substance they could find, the poor stank of their own defenses. But in noble houses, traps could be elaborate: soft leather pouches lined with linen, filled with perfumed bait, or treated with herbs like lavender and mint. These noble traps were worn under silken garments, almost like amulets, carefully hidden so that no one could see their wearer was battling the same vermin as the peasants outside. Some nobles even employed servants whose task was to prepare these traps fresh each morning, filling them with bait and then discreetly disposing of them by evening. Hygiene itself became a marker of class. Here's the real question: if these flea traps were used widely, why don't we hear about them in official chronicles? Why are they not taught in history classes, not depicted in paintings, not mentioned in sermons? Because to acknowledge them would have meant acknowledging that fleas were dangerous. That filth was not just a matter of sin or cleanliness, but of survival. The church, however, often discouraged talk of bodily hygiene, framing disease as divine punishment rather than something preventable. If fleas spread the plague, then perhaps God was not punishing humanity. Perhaps humanity was simply filthy and unprepared, and that truth was inconvenient. So instead of education, silence ruled. Priests instructed their flocks not to discuss bodily practices. Monks who recorded details were censored or ignored. Manuscripts that hinted too clearly at hygiene as prevention were quietly redacted. And the story of flea traps, grotesque, desperate, and revealing, nearly disappeared. Imagine being a medieval peasant. You sleep on a straw mattress filled with vermin. You share your one-room hut with goats, chickens, and a pig. Every night, fleas crawl over your skin. You wake up scratching. Your only hope is a pouch tied to your waist, a pouch that smells like death. Perhaps it's filled with rancid meat. It's perhaps with blood from the goat you slaughtered last winter. You wear it all day. You itch, you sweat, but you pray it keeps the fleas away from your children. Now, imagine being a nobleman, sleep on feather pads, in chambers lined with tapestries. We even hear fleas swarm, so you wear a silk pouch under your shirt, baited not with rancid scraps, but with herbs and sweetened wine. You pretend it doesn't exist. You smile at banquets, but you know the truth. You, too, are prey. The flea was the great equalizer. It cared nothing for gold, rank, or power, and the flea trap, disgusting as it was, became a quiet, hidden weapon in that eternal war. The forgotten lesson, and here's where it all becomes more than just trivia. Because flea traps show us something vital. People in the Middle Ages knew. They weren't ignorant, okay? They saw the connection between parasites and sickness, okay? They improvised defenses, okay? They adapted, but knowledge alone wasn't enough. Suppressed by religion, limited by technology, divided by class, their efforts were patchwork. The plague still came. Millions still died. In the truth that fleas and filth killed, not God's wrath, was buried along with them. So, the next time you spray insect repellent, wash your sheets, or complain about a mosquito bite, remember this? Not so long ago, people strapped sacks of blood and grease to their bodies just to survive. History almost forgot it. So I'll leave you with this chilling question. Would you have worn one of these traps, or would you have risked the bite? Drop your answer in the comments, because I read every single one. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe. There are far darker truths about medieval life still to uncover. Truths that were buried for centuries, ones you won't find in the history books. What if I told you that while peasants slept side by side with their families and animals in the cramped huts of medieval Europe, there was always one person outside who was forbidden to rest, an ominous figure whose very duty was to stay awake while the world went dark. Before I reveal why entire villages relied on this sleepless guardian, hit that subscribe button right now, because the secrets of medieval life we uncover here are the kind you'll never hear in school. Drop a comment below with what you think the Night Watcher really did. Was he a protector, a spy, or something much darker? And don't forget to like this video so that the truth about hidden history doesn't get buried again. It is the year 1375. The village is silent, wrapped in mist. Altar roofs glisten with dew. The only sound is the faint bleating of sheep penned beside homes. Families are bundled together in one-room huts, asleep by the glow of dying embers. Children lie pressed between parents and livestock, their breath mixing with the smoke of smoldering wood. Yet outside, on the crooked lanes, someone is awake. Cloaked figure walks slowly with a lantern and a staff, striking the ground with rhythmic knocks. He whispers a chant to remind villagers that time still moves, that the night is being watched. He is not allowed to sleep, not even to doze. His eyes must scan the shadows for fires, thieves, wolves, or enemies who come when no one else can see. This figure was called the Night Watcher. On the surface, the role was practical. Medieval villages were tinderboxes. Huts made of wood and straw could erupt into flames from a single spark. Bandits preyed on peasants. Wolves, bears, and even rival lord soldiers could descend under the cover of darkness. The Night Watcher was there to prevent disaster. But if you stop here, you miss the deeper truth. Because the more you look into historical records, the more you find that this wasn't just about protection. It was also about control. Chronicles from London, Lubeck, and Prague mentioned watchmen who not only guarded the streets, but also reported suspicious behavior to priests or lords. Imagine waking at midnight to relieve yourself outside, only to find a silent figure watching. His presence was safety, but also surveillance. You were never truly alone. even in your most private moments. Let's go deeper. Parish records from the 14th century. There are chilling instructions. The watcher shall pace the lanes and hear the sins whispered in darkness. Think about that. This was not simply about keeping fires at bay. The night watcher was tasked with listening, reporting, and ensuring that villagers could never conspire against their masters. It makes sense when you realize that in an age of heresy trials, peasant revolts, and secret gatherings, darkness was the only time for forbidden words. But the night watcher's presence ensured even whispers could be overheard. Archaeological evidence adds another layer. In some abandoned medieval villages, bells have been discovered near central posts, thought to have been rung at midnight, not just to mark time, but to reassure the people that the watcher was still awake. No bell rang, panic spread. Fires, raids, or even supernatural forces were believed to descend on an unguarded village. The night watcher wasn't just a human guard. He was a ritual presence. His wakefulness became a superstition in itself, a shield against the terrors of night. But here's where it turns darker. Some accounts claim that being the night watcher was not an honor, it was a punishment. In Bohemian records, the position was sometimes forced upon criminals or debtors who were condemned to walk the night endlessly. They weren't allowed to rest, for rest was luxury. Staying awake became torment. Think about the human cost. Nights in Northern Europe could stretch to 16 hours of darkness in winter. A watcher would pace, freezing, starving, alone, while the rest of the village slept. Sleep deprivation drove men mad. Some saw visions. Some claimed to hear voices. One record from Lubeck tells of a watcher who wrote, "Figures with burning eyes follow me in the fog." Weeks later, he disappeared. His replacement confessed in the log, "I hear the same whispers." Later versions of this manuscript were edited, the testimonies quietly erased. Why censor such accounts unless they revealed something authorities didn't want remembered? And the deeper you dig, the more sinister the role appears. The night watcher wasn't only a guard against thieves and wolves. He was an extension of authority, silent warning that no one, not even the poorest peasant, was free from observation. Even in the dead of night, under the illusion of privacy, someone was awake watching, listening, recording. Historians believe this practice was especially enforced in areas where heresy was feared, where revolts brewed, or where rival lords plotted. In other words, the watcher's presence wasn't about safety at all. It was about control, about crushing freedom before it could spark. But here's something more unsettling. Folk beliefs surrounding the watcher suggest he himself was feared. Villagers whispered that staying awake too long brought curses, that watchers went mad, became half human, half shadow. In certain tales, a watcher who survived too many winters without sleep was thought to become part of the night itself. Children were warned not to speak to him, for he was neither man nor ghost. Could this be simple superstition? Or was it the psychological toll of endless nights without rest, twisted into folklore? The presence of the night watcher even influenced architecture. Narrow lanes in medieval towns were designed to amplify the sound of a staff hitting stone, so that one man's footsteps could echo across an entire block. The knock, knock, knock on cobblestones wasn't just noise. Said was a reminder. Someone is awake and he is watching. So, was the night watcher a hero or a curse? Both answers may be true. He was a shield against wolves and fire, yes, but he was also a chain around the freedom of the people, ensuring no thought, no whisper, no meeting could escape the eye of power. And here, as the most chilling thought of all, the role of the night watcher didn't disappear. It evolved. Today, cameras watch our streets, satellites track our movement, algorithms record our searches. In the Middle Ages, a single man stayed awake so no village could act unseen. Entire systems do it without ever needing to sleep. So ask yourself this: what if every time you close your eyes, someone or something is still awake, still recording, still reporting. What if the idea of the sleepless watcher never left us, but only changed his face? The night watcher of medieval Europe may be long gone, but the truth is this: in the Middle Ages, even in sleep, you were never safe, and maybe still aren't. Subscribe now, because the stories they don't teach in school are the ones that matter most. And comment below. Would you have felt safer knowing someone was watching through the night tour, more afraid that you were never truly alone? You're standing in the middle of a medieval street. The air is thick with the stench of smoke, sweat, and something far worse, something so foul it makes your stomach twist. A man shuffles past you, hunched under the weight of a wooden bucket, dripping with filth. His clothes are ragged, his hands blackened, his eyes hollow. And here's the strangest part: this isn't punishment. It's his job. Before we go deeper, if you love untold stories of medieval Europe, make sure you subscribe right now. These hidden files drop every week, okay? Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Now, back to the filth. This man is a gong farmer, one of the weirdest, most disgusting, and yet most necessary professions in the Middle Ages. His job: to climb down into cesspits, shovel out human waste by the ton, and haul it away under cover of night. A job so revolting, entire towns would look the other way as he passed. A job that paid better than most honest labor, but at a cost you won't believe. The Middle Ages were not clean. Streets ran with mud, animals roamed freely, and chamber pots were emptied from windows with a careless splash. But beneath castles, monasteries, and taverns lurked something worse deep: pits built to hold years of accumulated waste, cesspits, the hidden underbelly of medieval life. And someone had to clean them. Enter the gong farmer. By day, he was invisible, often forbidden from public places, so he wouldn't spread his stench. He went to work, lowering himself into pits of human excrement with nothing more than a shovel, a bucket, and a torch. The smell clung to his skin. No amount of washing could remove it. His neighbors avoided him. His children, if he had any, carried the shame of his profession. And yet, gong farmers earned more in a single night than many peasants made in a week. Danger and disgust were the price of survival. But here's the thing: gong farmers weren't the only strange workers in medieval Europe. The Middle Ages were full of bizarre jobs that sound almost unbelievable today. Have you ever heard of a leech collector? Women waded into marshes with bare legs, letting blood-sucking leeches cling to them until their bodies were covered. They'd peel them off, drop them into jars, and sell them to physicians for medical purposes. The work was dangerous, the infections constant, and yet it fed a medical industry obsessed with balancing humors. Or what about the sign eater? When someone died, families in parts of Europe would pay a poor villager to eat bread and drink ale placed on the corpse's chest. By consuming the food, the sin eater was believed to absorb the dead person's sins, carrying them away. Imagine being so desperate for food that you took on not just the stench of death, but the weight of eternal damnation. Strange, disturbing, and yet completely real. But if you think that's the weirdest medieval work, wait until you hear about the job that required sticking your hands into something even deadlier than human waste. Let's go back to the streets. Imagine you're a rat catcher in a plague-ridden city. Bells of the church toll endlessly. Carts piled with corpses rumble past. Hey, and yet here you are, chasing rats with nothing but a stick, a sack, and maybe a terrier. People hate you, but they need you. Rats carried fleas, and fleas carried the Black Death. Your job wasn't glamorous. It wasn't safe. But every rat you caught meant a chance, however small, that another family might live. Then there were knocker-ups of the dead men who dragged corpses from houses during outbreaks, piling them into carts to be buried in mass graves. The pay was higher than farming, but so was the risk. One slip, one cough, and you joined the very bodies you carried. And still, some jobs were more humiliating than dangerous. Imagine being a fool or a worker in the textile trade whose job was to tread on newly woven cloth, soaking it in stale urine to soften and clean the fibers, day after day, hour after hour, stomping barefoot in vats of warm, reeking liquid. Or worse, the treadmill operator. Yes, a human being, strapped into a massive wooden wheel, like a hamster, walking endlessly to power mills or lift heavy stones for cathedral construction. Everywhere you turn in medieval Europe, you find lives defined by work we can barely imagine today. But there was one job that terrified even the toughest peasants. It's a job that was both sacred and cursed: the medieval executioner. At first, you might not think of it as a weird job. Executioners weren't seen as noble enforcers of justice. They were outcasts, cursed by the very society that demanded their work. Executioners and their families often lived on the edges of towns, banned from churches, markets, and guilds. Children of executioners were forced to marry within their own families or with other clean professions like gong farmers or grave diggers. And yet, the executioner held terrifying power. When he walked through the square, people averted their eyes, but when the day of judgment came, every eye turned to him. The axe glinted, the rope tightened, the fire roared. One swing, one mistake, and the crowd would turn on him. His job was to kill, but also to entertain. The spectacle of death was theater, and the executioner was both actor and director. Imagine the pressure of holding a sword above a trembling prisoner, knowing that if you missed, you wouldn't just botch the execution, you'd bring shame on your name for generations. And still, there was one job even stranger, a job so rare, most people today don't even believe it existed. Have you ever heard of the whipping boy? In royal courts, princes were considered too sacred to be punished. If a young prince misbehaved, his tutor or guardian couldn't lay a hand on him. So instead, another boy, usually of noble but lower rank, was raised alongside him. This boy was beaten whenever the prince did wrong. The idea was simple. Seeing his friends suffer would teach the prince discipline. Imagine being that boy. You grew up in luxury, shared meals and lessons with royalty. But at any moment, you could be dragged forward and whipped for someone else's sins. Loved, yet sacrificed. Educated, yet expendable. It was one of the strangest arrangements in medieval history, both cruel and ingenious. So, what was the weirdest medieval job? Gong farmers shoveling filth in the dark, sign eaters swallowing the dead's sins, executioners cursed by society, good, or the boy who suffered for a king. The truth is, medieval life was built on jobs we would never dare to do today. Jobs that remind us just how far we've come and how much people once endured just to survive. If you thought this job was strange, wait until you hear about the medieval dancing plague that drove entire towns insane. Subscribe so you don't miss the next Untold file. And so, we reach the end of our journey through the hidden life of the Middle Ages. For the last hours, we've stepped into a world that was harsher, darker, and stranger than most of us ever imagined. We walked through narrow, muddy streets where disease spread faster than whispers. We stood inside homes where families, livestock, and vermin lived under the same roof. We uncovered rituals meant to protect the soul, yet often invited fear instead. We listened to the echoes of a world where superstition and faith shaped every single decision of life and death. The Middle Ages were not the shining golden world of knights and kings that so many imagine. No, this was a time of survival. A time where even the smallest choice, what you ate, what you believed, what you feared, could mean the difference between life and death. And yet, there is something deeply human about this world, because beneath the mud and smoke, beneath the plague and the prayers, these people were not so different from us. They wanted safety. They wanted answers. They wanted to believe that the world made sense, even when it didn't. And perhaps that is why their world still fascinates us today, 'Cause in their strange fears and forgotten rituals, we see the echoes of our own world. Think about it, many of the beliefs we've uncovered tonight still linger. We still cross ourselves at shadows. We still cling to lucky charms. We still pass down superstitions without question. The line between the medieval and the modern is not as sharp as we think. Okay, now, before we close this chapter, I want to ask you something. Which part of this journey shocked you the most? Which medieval custom, ritual, or superstition will you still be thinking about when the lights go out tonight? Was it the villagers who believed that mirrors could steal your soul? Was it the fear of fresh air that shaped entire towns? Was it the strange, filthy jobs that people endured simply to survive? Tell me in the comments below. Hey, and don't forget to write where you are watching from, your country, your city, and what time it is right now. Are you in the stillness of midnight, imagining wolves howling outside your window? Or are you watching in the daylight, coffee in hand, shaking your head at how different life once was? Your answers matter, because this is not just a video, it is a community. Every time you comment, you connect with someone across the world who shares the same curiosity. Someone who, like you, dares to ask the strange questions. Someone who wants to know not just the polished history of kings and castles, but the raw truth of ordinary lives. This is what makes History Hooks different. Here, we don't just retell history. We open doors into forgotten worlds. We bring you the whispers, the rumors, the hidden truths that most people overlook. We dive into the shadows that textbooks often leave behind. And if you've made it this far into the video, then I know something about you. You are not just a casual viewer. You are part of this fellowship of seekers, people who aren't afraid to look beyond the surface of the past. And for that, I thank you. So here's my promise to you. This journey doesn't end tonight. There are still secrets waiting in the ruins. Still mysteries locked in dusty chronicles. Still forgotten voices echoing from the shadows of time. And in our next episode, we will uncover one of them, a story of forbidden knowledge, of secrets hidden away for centuries, of a mystery that challenges what we think we know about history itself. But that is a story for another night. Before you go, don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed the journey. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss the next hidden chapter we reveal. And most importantly, leave your voice in the comments. Tell me your thoughts, your reactions, and your location. Because together, we are building something greater than a channel. We are building a circle of history lovers across the world, united by curiosity. So keep your torches lit, keep your questions alive. And remember, history is never as far away as it seems. This was Untold Medieval History. Thank you for watching. Thank you for sharing this journey with me. And I'll see you in the next mystery.